This painting shows an open area in a forest leading to a beach and water. Trees are on the left and right forming an arc at the top. The bottom left shows people with leaves tied around their waists and feathers in their hair. Most have stripes painted on their bodies. The people are sitting, squatting, and standing in front of the trees while some hide behind the trees. A few are in the middle opening bowing. Fruits and vegetables are strewn all over the ground. In the center on the beach, people in armor, long pants and robes, stand with their arms stretched looking toward the group's center at white flags with crosses being held up high. A man in a long brown robe with a cross above his head stands in the center. One man wearing just pants bows down on one knee in front of the group. Boats are behind them on the shore with three large ships in the background further out in the water. Figure 5:1 Columbus making landfall. This image of Christopher Columbus making landfall in the New World was painted by the German-American artist Albert Bierstadt at the end of the 19th century. 10 feet long and 6 feet high, it presents Columbus in a romanticized fashion, with the indigenous people bowing before him. They would likely have portrayed the event quite differently. Credit: Modification of work, The Landing of Columbus by Albert Bierstadt / City of Plainfield, New Jersey / Wikimedia Commons, public domain. Chapter outline. 5:1 The Protestant Reformation. 5:2 Crossing the Atlantic. 5:3 The Mercantilist Economy. 5:4 The Atlantic Slave Trade. The 16th century was a time of momentous change in Europe. The age of exploration began in the late 1400s with forays into the Atlantic by two European nations, Portugal and Spain. Although these countries took the lead and Christopher Columbus has been glorified as a central figure in the history of that exploration, Figure 5:1. They were soon joined by other European players including England, France, the Netherlands, and Denmark. Their extensive overseas exploration and the exploding web of connections in the Atlantic world, the Columbian Exchange, the colonization of the Americas, and the development of the Atlantic slave trade, forever changed people's understanding of what the world was like and the face and direction of history. Yet far more was altered in the 16th century than the human conception of the earth. Profound changes in European religious belief also transformed the way many Christians thought of the life they hoped for beyond this one. A timeline with events from this chapter is shown. 1000, Viking exploration of North America begins. A map of land and water with labels is shown. 1139, Alfonso Henriques becomes King of Portugal. A picture of a man dressed as a knight sitting with a crown and shield is shown. 1488, Bartolomeu Dias sails around Africa. 1492, Columbus arrives in the Americas. A picture of people coming off boats walking toward Native Americans is shown. 1494, Treaty of Tordesillas signed. A map showing the Treaty of Tordesillas is shown. 1517, Protestant Reformation begins. 1521, Spaniards defeat the Aztecs. A picture is shown of a man with a sword holding another man by his hair. 1526, Portuguese transport enslaved Africans to the Americas. 1607, British found Jamestown. 1675 to 1676, King Philip's War. A man in ornate garb is standing with a spear. 1776, Adam Smith publishes The Wealth of Nations. Figure 5:2 Timeline. Foundations of the Atlantic World. Credit 1000, Modification of Work Skalholt Map by Sigurd Stefansson / Wikimedia Commons, public domain. Credit 1139. Modification of Work, King Afonso Henriques, first King of Portugal, in a 16th century miniature in the Portuguese genealogy, Genealogia dos Reis de Portugal, / British Library / Wikimedia Commons, public domain. Credit 1492. Modification of Work, The Landing of Columbus by Albert Bierstadt / City of Plainfield, New Jersey / Wikimedia Commons, public domain. Credit 1494. Modification of work, map of meridian line set under the Treaty of Tordesillas, by Library of Congress / Wikimedia Commons, public domain. Credit, 1521. Modification of work, an indigenous Mexican complaint against an abusive encomendero, by Codex Kingsborough / Wikimedia Commons, public domain. Credit, 1675-1676. Modification of work, Philip King of Mount Hope by Paul Revere, by Yale University Art Gallery / Wikimedia Commons, public domain. A map of the world is shown. A red box highlights all of South America, the eastern half of North America, nearly all of Africa, Iceland, all of Europe, and the southern tip of Greenland. Figure 5. 3 locator map, foundations of the Atlantic world. Credit. Modification of work, world map blank shorelines, by Maciej Jaros / Wikimedia Commons, public domain. Learning objectives. By the end of this section, you will be able to explain the causes of the Protestant Reformation, describe differences between Protestant and Catholic beliefs, discuss the spread of Protestantism in Europe and the wars of religion, describe the Catholic response to the Protestant Reformation. When Columbus set sail across the Atlantic in 1492, the people of Western and Central Europe, regardless of their country or language, were united by a common religion. In the same year as Columbus's momentous voyage, Spain defeated the last Muslim stronghold on the Iberian Peninsula and expelled Jewish people from the land. Muslims were given a brief respite, but in 1501 they too were ordered to leave or to convert to Catholicism. With the exception of small Jewish communities in the Low Countries, Belgium and the Netherlands, and the German lands, at the beginning of the 16th century, the people of Western and Central Europe were uniformly Roman Catholics. Challenges to the authority of the Catholic Church were brewing, however, and the passage of less than a century found Europeans hopelessly divided over matters of faith as the result of an event known as the Protestant Reformation. The origins of the Protestant Reformation. The Protestant Reformation began in 1517, but its seeds had been sown years earlier. Over the course of the Middle Ages, the Catholic Church had grown richer, and its higher clerical offices had become dominated by people motivated more by the desire for wealth and power than by spiritual concerns. Although Europe's peasants remained devoutly attached to their faith, critics claimed that popes acted less like Christ's representatives on earth and more like secular princes, intervening in European political affairs and even commanding armies. Members of the clergy often lived lavishly in palatial surroundings and dressed themselves in silks and furs. Some had mistresses and illegitimate children, who were often given positions in the church. Wealthy families often purchased church offices for their members, and some men held bishoprics areas under the authority of a bishop, in more than one place at a time, by hiring other men to perform their offices. Secular rulers, kings, and princes jealous of the churches, power sometimes vied with the pope for control of the churches in their territory and welcomed opportunities to reject the church's authority. During the 15th century, in the city-states of northern Italy, an intellectual movement called humanism had taken hold. Humanism stressed the value and dignity of human beings, and its scholars believed that, through the study of the philosophy, history, and literature of ancient Greece and Rome, people could improve themselves and live a good life, which, in turn, would improve the societies in which they lived. Italian humanists were often devout Christians, and their study of ancient authors did not lead them to reject the teachings of the Catholic Church. In the second half of the 15th century, Northern European scholars championed a form of humanism whose explicit goal was to make people better Christians. Northern Renaissance humanism, also called Christian humanism, stressed the study of the works of Greece and Rome together with the teachings of the early Christian fathers to improve the state of the human soul. The goal of learning was to awaken an inner sense of piety, and Northern Renaissance humanists, such as Desiderius Erasmus encouraged people to use Christian teachings as a guide to daily life. This inner transformation, they believed, was superior to engaging in such outer forms of religious devotion as going on pilgrimage or fasting at prescribed times of the year. By becoming better Christians, people would ultimately reform the Church. Discontent among some European Catholics and an interest in spiritual transformation in Northern Europe set the stage for a German monk named Martin Luther to try to eliminate the questionable practices of the medieval Roman Catholic Church. Luther's actions began the Protestant Reformation. In 1517, Luther, then a professor at the University of Wittenberg in Germany, became outraged when the Dominican friar Johann Tetzel began to sell indulgences in Wittenberg, authorized by Albert, Archbishop of the city of Mainz. Indulgences were a way to reduce or even cancel the time after death, during which people needed to suffer in purgatory to atone for their sins before reaching heaven. These rewards could be earned by performing actions of great religious merit, such as going on crusade. However, the Church also taught that the Pope controlled a store of merit amassed by Jesus and the Christian saints, whose virtue was so great they had entered heaven with grace left over. The Church could allot this extra virtue to someone else in the form of an indulgence. Luther had long been obsessed with thoughts of achieving salvation, the goal of all Christians. He was horrified at the idea that sinners might believe they could enter heaven not through repentance or God's mercy, but by paying for an indulgence. He drafted 95 arguments explaining why the sale of indulgences was wrong, and according to many historians, he then nailed the 95 Theses to the door of the castle church at Wittenberg. He also distributed printed copies throughout Germany and sent a copy to Archbishop Albert, who passed it along to Rome. In their own words, the 95 Theses, Martin Luther argued that the sale of indulgences was wrong. He believed only God could grant forgiveness, and that humans could do nothing to ensure their salvation, which depended entirely upon God. This is known as the doctrine of justification by faith. Luther also said the Pope had no control over purgatory, and that there was no foundation in the Bible for the belief that the merit amassed by Jesus and the saints could be given to others. His intent in the 95 Theses was to spark a discussion within the Church that would lead to reform. Following are several of the Theses. 6. The Pope cannot remit any guilt, except by declaring and showing that it has been remitted by God, or, to be sure, by remitting guilt in cases reserved to his judgment. If his right to grant remission in these cases were disregarded, the guilt would certainly remain unforgiven. 35. They who teach that contrition is not necessary on the part of those who intend to buy souls out of purgatory or to buy confessional privileges preach unchristian doctrine. 36. Any truly repentant Christian has a right to full remission of penalty and guilt, even without indulgence letters. 37. Any true Christian, whether living or dead, participates in all the blessings of Christ and the Church, and this is granted him by God, even without indulgence letters. 38. Nevertheless, papal remission and blessing are by no means to be disregarded, for they are, as I have said, Thesis 6, the proclamation of the divine remission. 41. Papal indulgences must be preached with caution, lest people erroneously think that they are preferable to other good works of love. 43. Christians are to be taught that he who gives to the poor or lends to the needy does a better deed than he who buys indulgences. 51. Christians are to be taught that the Pope would and should wish to give of his own money, even though he had to sell the Basilica of St. Peter, to many of those from whom certain hawkers of indulgences cajole money. Martin Luther, 95 Theses. What does Luther say about the forgiveness of sin? What evidence do you see that Luther had not yet completely broken with Catholic teachings? Do you see evidence that Luther is trying to be conciliatory toward the Pope? Do you see anything likely to anger the Pope? Although Luther had probably merely wished to reform the practices of the Church, such as ending the sale of indulgences, and not to spark a rebellion against the church. His actions were not seen that way. In 1518, he was summoned by church authorities to answer questions regarding the position he expressed in the 95 Theses. At a meeting in the German city of Augsburg, Luther denied that the church had the power to distribute merits amassed by Jesus and the saints. His beliefs were officially condemned by Pope Leo X, and he was ordered to recant, which he refused to do. In 1521, he was excommunicated, excluded from participating in the life of the church. The version of Christianity that developed from Luther's ideas, and that formed the basis for what became the Protestant faith, differed from the official teachings of the Roman Catholic Church in important ways. The Catholic Church taught that salvation was achieved through a combination of religious faith and good works. Buying an indulgence was regarded as a good work because the money went to the church. Luther taught that faith alone was sufficient for salvation, and that humans were unable to work toward their own redemption, which depended entirely upon God, figure 5:4. Furthermore, adherence to centuries' worth of Catholic tradition was not necessary to be a good Christian. Luther contended that Scripture alone should be the source of Christian belief and practice. His followers thus abandoned many traditional Catholic practices, including clerical celibacy. Luther, a monk, married Katharina von Bora, a former nun, and began a family. Protestants also called for the abolition of religious orders of monks and nuns. A life in the clergy, which the Catholic Church had proclaimed the greatest of all callings, was considered no better than the pursuit of any other vocation in life. The printing press with movable type, developed in Europe during the Renaissance, aided Martin Luther in his efforts to spread his message, and thousands of copies of Luther's writings circulated throughout Europe. A painting is shown with a tree in the middle, dividing the painting in half. The top of the tree is bare on the left and leafy on the right. The left side of the painting shows lush grasses and trees. At the top, a man in robes sits on a round blue orb with angels blaring horns above him. The man is surrounded by an oval array of clouds, with a group of people dressed in light-colored robes on each side of him. Below him on the left are a man and woman dressed only in leaves below the waist, standing in front of a tree holding an apple. To their right is a city of white tents with bodies lying on the ground. A statue of a snake is erected in the city. Below the city is a skeleton who holds a spear running next to a demon. They are both chasing a naked man into fire and smoke that is in the corner of the painting. To the right of the man, 4 men in robes and head coverings are pointing to a stone tablet with writing on it. The right side of the painting shows a man in the sky. He wears a loincloth and a red robe and holds a pole with a red flag with a white cross on it. A yellow orb shines behind him. Toward the left of the right half, a man in a red robe holds a book and speaks with a naked man, pointing to the right corner where a man hangs on a cross, wearing a crown of thorns and a cloth around his waist. Below the cross is a lamb walking over the crumbled bodies of the demon and skeleton that lie on the ground. Behind the cross is an opening of a cave. Green and lush grasses and trees are shown, and there is a city in the middle left background. A group of shepherds and their sheep are in a meadow. Figure 5:4 Allegory of Law and Grace. The 1529 painting Allegory of Law and Grace by the German artist Lucas Cranach the Elder illustrates Martin Luther's teachings. In the image on the left, the law, the 10 Commandments inscribed on a tablet, cannot save the sinner being chased by the devil into hell. On the right, John the Baptist in a red robe shows the sinner the crucified Jesus, a gift sent by God to save human beings. Credit, modification of work Law and Gospel by Herzoglich's Museum, Gotha/Wikimedia Commons, public domain. Calvinists, Anabaptists, and Anglicans. Efforts to silence Martin Luther were unsuccessful, and the new form of Christianity called Protestantism spread throughout the German-speaking lands. By the end of the 16th century, it had become entrenched throughout Western and Central Europe as well. Often the new religion was welcomed by rulers as a reason to reject the Pope's authority, and Luther called upon the German princes to do so. The Catholic Holy Roman Emperor Charles V, who was also Charles I of Spain, steadfastly opposed Protestantism. However, the 1555 Peace of Augsburg secured for rulers in the empire who were Lutheran, as Luther's followers were called, the right to establish Lutheranism as the official religion within their lands if they wished. A prince's subjects were obliged to support the church he chose. Many rulers in northern Germany became Lutheran, but in Austria and Bavaria, in the southern part of the German-speaking lands, the Roman Catholic Church retained its power. No other religions were accommodated. In Switzerland, the ideas of the Reformation that Luther began were embraced by Ulrich Huldrych Zwingli in the city of Zurich. Zwingli, who had been a priest, called for radical changes, such as a rejection of the Catholic tenet of transubstantiation, which held that Jesus was physically present in the communion wine and wafer consecrated during every Mass. Even Martin Luther had not gone so far. Zwingli also preached against fasting in the period before major religious holidays and called for religious imagery to be removed from churches. He banned organs from churches, shut monasteries and convents, and had the Bible printed in German rather than Latin. Zwingli also called for an end to clerical celibacy and proclaimed that the Bible never referred to purgatory. He was killed in 1531 in a conflict between the Catholic and Protestant areas of Switzerland. Among those inspired by Zwingli's ideas was Conrad Grebel, a Swiss merchant. Grebel was especially moved by Zwingli's claims that baptism, through which people were admitted into church membership, should be delayed until adulthood when a person is capable of making the choice to renounce sin. Finding Zwingli too slow in reforming the Christian community in Zurich, however, Grebel established his own religious movement in 1524, the Swiss Brethren. The Swiss Brethren was one of several Anabaptist churches rejecting infant baptism in favor of adult baptism, that were established in the 16th century, primarily in Central Europe and the Low Countries. Because baptism was believed to remove the taint of original sin, the transgression of Adam and Eve, infant baptism was the norm among Catholics and most Protestants as well. Anabaptists, however, believed that only adults could meaningfully renounce sin and make a declaration of faith. Thus, only adults could make the conscious decision to become Christians. But since people could be baptized only once, anyone rebaptized as an adult was violating a tenet of the Catholic faith. Other Anabaptist movements included the Hutterites, the Mennonites, and the Amish, which broke from the larger Mennonite movement in the 17th century. Besides believing in adult baptism, Anabaptist groups advocated the separation of church and state and tended to be pacifists. Because of their refusal to hold public office, serve in the army, or accept secular rulers' right to control religious affairs, Anabaptists were widely feared by most European rulers and were often subject to violent attacks. Another center of Protestant thought was the city of Geneva in what is now Switzerland. The city's religious leader, John Calvin, had been raised a Catholic in France, but he became a Protestant either before or shortly after fleeing to Switzerland to escape persecution for his beliefs. His ideas were similar to those of Martin Luther, but they differed in one crucial respect. Calvin espoused a doctrine known as predestination, which held that God had predetermined which souls would be granted salvation upon death and which were destined for hell. No person could ever know for certain whether they were saved or damned, and there was nothing they could do to ensure salvation. Calvinists embraced the doctrine, and despite its denial of human agency, they strove to lead a rigidly moral lifestyle focused on hard work and piety, seeking, in their ability to live like people destined for heaven, reassurance that they had in fact been saved. They rejected dancing, public drunkenness, gambling, and obscene speech as ungodly and fit for punishment by a special tribunal called the consistory. Calvinism spread rapidly outside Geneva and found adherents in the Netherlands who established the Dutch Reformed Church, in Scotland where the Presbyterian Church was formed, and in France where its adherents were called Huguenots. Martin Luther, Ulrich Zwingli, John Calvin, and the Anabaptist leaders were true believers in the doctrines they espoused. The English Reformation, however, was of a different character. In England, reform was initially imposed from the top down, not by a committed convert, but by a king looking for an expedient way to exchange one queen for another. Until the moment he decided to remove himself from under the Pope's authority, Henry VIII of England had a reputation as a devout Catholic and a critic of Luther. He was married to Catherine of Aragon, the daughter of the Spanish monarchs Ferdinand and Isabella, who were famous for defeating the Muslim kingdom of Granada and expelling Jewish and Muslim people from the Iberian Peninsula. Henry and Catherine's marriage had produced only one living child, a daughter, Mary. Although English law did not exclude women from inheriting the throne, Henry wanted to take no chances with the succession following his death and desired a son whose rule would go unchallenged. Accordingly, against Catherine's wishes, Henry sought an annulment of his marriage so he might marry Anne Boleyn, who he believed would give him sons. Unlike a divorce, which the Catholic Church did not permit, an annulment simply declared a marriage null and void on the grounds it had never been legitimate. Henry argued that, because Catherine had first been married to his late elder brother Arthur, Catholic Church law prohibiting the marriage of close relatives should never have allowed her and Henry to wed. When the Pope refused to annul the marriage, Henry declared the English Church no longer bound by the Pope's authority. In 1534, Parliament passed the Act of Supremacy, establishing the Church of England with the English monarch as its head. The Archbishop of Canterbury, the highest spiritual authority in the land, finally granted the annulment of Henry and Catherine's marriage. Henry had already quietly married Anne in time to see her give birth to a daughter, Elizabeth, later Elizabeth I. Under Henry's leadership, the Church of England, also known as the Anglican Church, remained largely Catholic in terms of both doctrine and ritual. Henry closed England's monasteries, but his failure to purge the English Church of all elements of Roman Catholicism did not sit well with many Protestants. Upon Henry's death, his son Edward VI, whose mother Jane Seymour had been Henry's third wife, became king. Because Edward was still a minor, England was governed by regents who took steps to make the Anglican Church more Protestant, a move with which the young Edward agreed. Priests were allowed to marry. The practice of using rosary beads in prayer was denounced. Church processions were prohibited, and statues and stained glass windows were removed from churches. The Mass service was reformed, eliminating many Roman Catholic rituals, and the English-language Book of Common Prayer, published in 1549, laid out the new church service. Ministers who refused to use the Book of Common Prayer risked being removed from their positions and imprisoned. The Catholic Reformation and the Wars of Religion. The leaders of the Catholic Church did not sit idly by as its members deserted it for new faiths. The Catholic Reformation, also called the Counter-Reformation, was the Catholic Church's effort to address Luther's challenges as well as to effect other necessary reforms. One means to do so was the 1545 Council of Trent. There, Europe's bishops and other clerics affirmed that both good works and faith were required for salvation, and that both Scripture, as interpreted by the Church, and tradition were acceptable sources of authority. The Council also affirmed the doctrine of transubstantiation. Aware of very real problems within the Church, the Council undertook a series of reforms as well. Indulgences were retained, but their sale was forbidden. The Council prohibited church officials from appointing relatives to church offices, limited bishops to holding office in only one bishopric, and took steps to improve the education of Catholic clergy and curb their luxurious habits. Another aspect of the Catholic Reformation was the creation of new religious orders. Founded by the Spanish noble Ignatius of Loyola, the Society of Jesus, also known as the Jesuits, assumed a number of tasks, chiefly the education of young Catholic men. They also undertook responsibility for the conversion of non-Christians to Roman Catholicism and for acting as advisors to the Catholic rulers of Europe. Unlike other religious orders, the Jesuits did not have a female branch. Instead, the Ursuline Order of Nuns, founded a few years before, undertook the education of young women. Although the Catholic Reformation undoubtedly prevented the defection of many Catholics to Protestant churches, the new churches continued to gain adherents in many parts of Europe. At times, this was a peaceful process. At other times, wars erupted as devout Catholics did battle with equally devout Protestants to protect what both sides believed was the only true expression of Christian faith. The transition from Catholicism to Protestantism in England was more peaceful than elsewhere. While Henry VII's Catholic daughter Mary I, the child of Catherine of Aragon, occupied the throne following her brother Edward's death, Protestants were persecuted, and hundreds were executed as the Queen tried to restore England to the Catholic Church. Mary died in 1558 before she could achieve this, however. Her younger half-sister, Elizabeth I, wished to govern an orderly, stable country, and while late in her reign she did persecute Catholics she felt posed a threat to her Protestant rule, she adopted a relatively moderate approach to religion during her early years on the throne. Figure 5. 5. In this painting, a man sits on an ornate gold throne with a crest and green canopy above, a highly decorated wall behind, and detailed rugs below. He is wearing white stockings, red robes, and a hat with a feather. With his right hand, the man holds a scepter up. With his left hand, the man hands a little boy dressed in white stockings and green robes a sword. Next to the boy stand two women in very elaborate long gowns, holding hands. Behind them is a lady in a red plain cloth holding a bouquet of flowers. A man and woman stand on the left side of the painting. They are dressed in elaborate, dark coats, gowns, and hats. Behind them, a man in military armor and a helmet holds a shield with one hand and an upraised large stick in his other hand and runs toward the pair. A city can be seen in the far background. Figure 5. 5. The family of Henry VIII, an allegory of the Tudor succession. This 4 by 6 foot painting by Lucas de Heer dates from about 1572 during Elizabeth's reign. Elizabeth's father Henry VIII, whose family name was Tudor, sits in the center next to his young son Edward VI, to whom he gives the sword of justice. On the left is Mary I with her husband the King of Spain, and behind them is Mars, the Roman god of war. Elizabeth I herself stands on the right, flanked by peace and plenty. Credit: The Family of Henry VIII, an allegory of the Tudor succession, by National Museum, Cardiff/Wikimedia Commons, public domain. Parliament's 1558 Act of Supremacy, once again, declared the Church of England separate from the Roman Catholic Church. The following year, the Act of Uniformity of 1559 brought back the Book of Common Prayer as the only legal form of worship in England. Some concessions were made, however, to those who did not wish to abandon Catholic ritual. The condemnation of the Pope contained in an earlier version of the book was removed, and the communion ritual was described in a way that avoided making a clear statement about transubstantiation. Clergy could continue to wear traditional Catholic robes and ornaments. During Elizabeth's reign, English Calvinists, known as Puritans, attempted unsuccessfully to move the Church of England even further from the doctrine and ritual of the Catholic Church. Many clergy in the English Church were Puritans, and they objected to wearing Catholic robes during church services and making the sign of the cross during baptism. By the 1570s and 1580s, Puritans had also come to oppose the structure of the Church of England, in which the monarch was the head of the church. They believed churches should be independent and governed by groups of elected elders instead of a king or queen. Elizabeth was unwilling to change the manner in which the Church of England was governed, however. During the reign of her successor James I, Puritans who wished to separate from the Church of England, known as separatists, began to depart England for places, including mainland Europe and North America, where they believed they would be able to establish ideal Christian communities. In the reign of Charles I, James's son, other Puritans also began to leave, linked to learning. English Puritans who immigrated to British colonies in North America used a book called the New England Primer to teach their children to read, while also imparting religious lessons. This website presents images of the book, first printed in the 1680s. Pages 15 to 18 contain the alphabet and short rhymes to help children remember the letters. A. In Adam's fall we sinned all. Outside England, the dispute over whether a kingdom should be Catholic or Protestant could be quite violent. In 1572 in France, warfare between Huguenots and Catholics culminated in the August 23 St. Bartholomew's Day Massacre, assassinations targeting prominent Huguenots who had come to Paris for a royal wedding. Peace was restored only when the Huguenot Henry IV succeeded to the throne of France, converted to Catholicism, the religion of the majority of French people, and issued the Edict of Nantes in 1598. The edict established Catholicism as the official religion of France, but also granted Huguenots the right to worship as they chose. In the Spanish Netherlands, Philip II of Spain, son and heir of Charles V, fought against Calvinist rebels. War raged from 1568 until a truce was signed in 1609. After Philip's death in 1598, his son Philip III fought on after him. Peace was restored, but the 7 northern provinces established their independence from Spain as the United Provinces of the Netherlands. The Netherlands was not the only place in which Philip II, who regarded himself and Spain as defenders of Catholicism, fought to maintain the Church's supremacy. In 1588, he launched a naval attack on England with the intent of restoring it to the Catholic Church and ending its support for Protestant rebels in the Spanish Netherlands. The invasion failed. The Spanish Armada was famously outmaneuvered by the smaller, faster English ships, and as the remaining vessels started for home by sailing north around Scotland and Ireland, most were destroyed by a storm. The wars of religion continued into the 17th century. From 1618 to 1648, the 30 Years' War between Catholic and Protestant states raged in the Holy Roman Empire. As German Catholics, Lutherans, and Calvinists fought one another, other European countries entered the fray. Sweden, a Lutheran land, supported the Protestant German rulers, as did the United Provinces of the Netherlands. Denmark also entered the war in the hopes of gaining German territory to offset its losses to Sweden in recent conflicts. France joined in on the side of the Protestants, primarily in an effort to become the preeminent power in Europe. Despite the multinational nature of the combatants, battles were fought almost entirely within the German lands, whose people suffered as armies of mercenaries destroyed farms and villages. In the end, the German Protestants were victorious, and France had become the dominant country in Western Europe. The Peace of Westphalia, which ended the war in 1648, established the independence of each of the entities, numbering nearly 1,000, that had made up the Holy Roman Empire. Learning objectives. By the end of this section, you will be able to explain how technological innovations in the 15th century made transatlantic journeys possible, discuss the motives for Spanish and Portuguese exploration in the Americas, analyze the impact of the Treaty of Tordesillas on the Atlantic world, describe the physical and cultural ramifications of the Columbian Exchange. During the European Middle Ages, the Middle East and North Africa entered a golden age of learning. As Europeans increasingly made connections with peoples across the Mediterranean and in Central and East Asia, ideas from this golden age trickled back to them that influenced sailors, explorers, and shipbuilders. Then, in the 15th and 16th centuries, innovators in navigation and exploration pushed Europeans to expand their trade networks across the globe and connect with new places and peoples. The most notable voyages of this period, known as the Age of Exploration, were the transatlantic voyages of Genoese explorer Christopher Columbus in the 1490s, underwritten by King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella of Spain. The rise of maritime nations. Christopher Columbus's 1492 voyage did not represent the first contact between European explorers and indigenous peoples on the North American continent. Through archaeological and historical research, historians can now date that contact to nearly 500 years before Columbus reached his first stop in the Caribbean. In the early 1000s, Leif Erikson, a Viking explorer living in Greenland, heard from fellow explorer Bjarni Herjolfsson that another land lay only a few hundred miles to the west. In a journey during which he was blown off course, Ericsson found a land to the west that he called Vinland, for the grapes that grew near its shores. He stayed there only through the winter, never making direct contact with the indigenous peoples and returning to Greenland in the spring. His brother Thorvald was the first to make contact, which ended in violent conflict and the deaths of several Native Americans and Thorvald himself. In a third exploration, men and women of Ericsson's family encountered the indigenous people of Vinland again, but maintained peace, creating a small but steady relationship with them based on trade. Figure 5. 6. The map shows a body of water in the middle, with islands in the bottom right and 4 near the center. Around the body of water is land denoted with wavy lines and peninsulas. A label is shown in the middle with ornate writing. Figure 5-6 North America as seen by the Norse. An Icelandic map from 1690 shows North America with Norse, medieval Scandinavian place names, like Markland, Labrador Peninsula, and Helluland, Baffin Island. Credit, Skalholt map by Sigurd Stephenson /Wikimedia Commons, public domain. The Viking explorers referred to these indigenous peoples as Skrælings. Scholars are not sure which indigenous group they belonged to, but 20th-century archaeological digs in Nova Scotia have verified much of the information found in the Icelandic sagas of Vinland. In the 1960s, explorers Helge and Anne Ingstad discovered in Newfoundland, Canada, the buried ruins of a Viking camp from around the time of Ericsson's explorations, in a place called Elance Ox Meadows. This find definitively proved at last that the Norse had traveled to the Americas before Columbus. Over the years, it has been suggested that other people besides the Vikings also discovered the Americas before Columbus, including Irish monks, African sailors, and Chinese members of Admiral Zheng He's treasure fleet. There is no widely accepted proof of any of these voyages, however. Link to learning. Learn how archaeologists found evidence of Viking settlers in Canada and were able to determine the year the Norse were in North America. The settlements in Newfoundland never became permanent, likely because indigenous groups developed an increasing hostility toward the often violent Vikings. By the 1400s, the frontier colonies of Greenland populated by Norse peoples had also all but disappeared. But knowledge of a land farther west survived in the Norse sagas, and it is possible that it trickled across Europe into Italy and Spain, and eventually into the mind of a young Christopher Columbus. In the meantime, with the collapse of Constantinople and the fall of the Byzantine Empire to the Ottomans in 1453, many Europeans felt a sense of doom. Not only had they lost a bastion of Christian power, but Muslims now controlled their tenuous overland connections to South and East Asia. As a result, they now had to go through Muslim intermediaries to purchase valuable spices such as cinnamon, pepper, cloves, and nutmeg that grew in only a few key locations. European nations, therefore, wanted to find an all-water passage to India and the chain of sparsely populated Indonesian islands known as the Spice Islands. In the 15th century, Europe experienced a timely navigational revolution as a result of adopting new non-Western maritime technologies. In the first millennium CE, Arab sailors in the Middle East had created the lateen sail, a triangular sail that allowed ships to travel against the wind. The square European sail gave ships power, but the lateen sail increased their ability to maneuver. When Europeans combined the two kinds of sail on three-masted ships, they could navigate confidently in any direction. The stern-post rudder, created in China in the 13th century, also allowed for steering against the currents. For directional guidance, the ancient Greek astrolabe, which used constellations as a guide and enabled mariners to find their north-south position on the Earth's surface, came to Europe after being refined in the Middle East, figure 5. 7. The magnetic compass also came to Europe in the 15th century, making its way from China, where it was guiding ships by 1100 CE. The adoption of these inventions allowed Europeans to abandon their long-standing practice of navigating by sailing along a coastline. Now they could venture into the open ocean, beyond sight of land. Two images are shown. Image A shows a three-sailed boat with many ropes running up and down from the masts. It is sailing in the water. Openings run along the hull of the boat. Image B shows a triangle shape made by the ground, a tall, skinny building, and a man holding a round object. A line connects the round object to the top of the building. Words are written along the line, the left side of the building, the ground, and behind the person. The word MENSVRAT1IBVS and number 72 is written across the top, and the words SCQVITVRALIVS are shown along the bottom. Figure 5. 7. Technological advances in navigation. A. Lateen sails like the ones in this drawing enabled ships to sail into the wind. B. Astrolabes, instruments used for measuring slope and elevation, aided in navigation. In this 16th century illustration, a man measures the height of a building using an astrolabe. Credit, a modification of work, Lateen Sails by Pearson Scott Forsman / Wikimedia Commons, public domain. Credit B. Modification of work, Elucidatio Fabrici Usuk Astrolabii. Ex secunda auto ris recognition by Johann Sturfler / Wikimedia Commons, public domain. Link to learning. Learn how an astrolabe works in this video. How to use an astrolabe by William Greenwood of the British Museum. A short but thorough explanation of the mechanics of an incredible navigational tool. However, technological advancements and a desire for expanded trade and territory could take explorers only so far without financial backing. The commercial empire that funded European overseas exploration began in the Italian city-states of the Middle Ages, but the investment system on which it was based did not originate there. This system, called commenda, established a sort of financial patronage by which investors funded merchants to expand their trading enterprises and earned a more extensive business network in the process. Like many of the technologies that drove European ships, the commenda was first developed by Muslim merchants. By the late 15th century, Italian city-states were supporting a variety of small, family-owned businesses and large companies. Capital was concentrated in land and commerce rather than in industrial pursuits, but credit was widely used. Across Europe, risk-sharing business ventures and joint investment schemes were already commonplace among merchants. Spain, which Muslim rulers had conquered and settled, had connections across the Mediterranean to Africa and the Middle East, while Northern and Central Europe wielded a sprawling maritime exchange across the North and Baltic Seas. Portuguese exploration. In the late 1400s, both Portugal and Spain were emerging from centuries of rule by North African Muslim states. Portugal had become an independent country by the 12th century, figure 5. 8. At the beginning of the 15th century, it was a small country with poor soil. However, it did have one advantage, a geographical location that lent itself to exploration, specifically down the African coastline and across the Atlantic. Portugal also had plenty of coves and natural harbors suited for shipping. and speedy crosswinds and currents that gave it a shipping superhighway of sorts between northern and southern Europe. Various nearby islands such as the Azores also teemed with untapped fishing potential. In the drawing, a man sits on a brown, ornately carved tree branch. He wears full body armor over a red shirt, a helmet with gold trim, and a white and gold robe. Various green tassels and gold buckles decorate his armor. He holds an ornate axe and a shield with white ovals. Portions of other similar shields are shown on the right and left sides. Across the top, a red flowing banner displays Elri Dafoso Anric with a V in the middle of the Q as Figure 5, 8 Afonso Henriques. In this detail from a page in an illuminated manuscript of the 1530s, Afonso Henriques declares himself king of the independent country of Portugal following his victory over Muslim forces at the Battle of Arique in 1139. Credit: King Afonso Henriques, first king of Portugal, in a 16th century miniature in the Portuguese genealogy, Genealogia dos Reis de Portugal, /British Library /Wikimedia Commons, public domain. In the 1340s, King Afonso IV of Portugal raised public funds to build a commercial fleet that by the 15th century had transformed the nation into a maritime power. In 1341, the Portuguese sailed to the Canary Islands in the Atlantic. This was only the beginning of their exploration and conquest. In 1415, John I, grandson of Afonso IV, dispatched Portuguese forces to capture the city of Ceuta in Morocco. John hoped that control of a port on the North African coast would open that continent to both conquest and trade. To further cement his control of the region, he requested papal recognition of his efforts. In April 1418, Pope Martin V granted the Portuguese king the right to all African lands taken from Muslim rulers. Under John's son, Prince Henry, dubbed the Navigator by historians, Portuguese explorers claimed the Madeira Islands, the Azores, and the Cape Verde Islands off the coast of Africa. They also sailed down the western coast of Africa as far as today's Sierra Leone. Eventually, Portuguese expeditions reached the southern tip of Africa, and in 1488, Bartolomeu Dias, who had participated in the Battle of Ceuta, sailed around the Cape of Good Hope to reach the eastern side of the continent. The Portuguese were driven by both religious fervor and a desire for wealth. Since the Middle Ages, they, like other Europeans, had been intrigued by stories of a lost Christian kingdom somewhere in Africa or Asia, ruled by a legendary king named Prester John, figure 5. 9. By the 1400s, they had come to believe his lands were located in Africa, and their hope of forming an alliance with him to defeat the forces of Islam helped motivate their exploration there. A drawing shows a man with a white beard sitting on a large brown throne. He is wearing blue and red robes, red socks, a gold ornate crown on his head, and is holding a tall, intricate scepter. A tall white tower on brown land is located behind the throne on the left, and 3 solid colored and decorated tents are located on the right of the drawing. Map lines run crisscross throughout the drawing, and the word Prilte is written in green across the top right by blue, cloudy mountains. Figure 5-9 Prester John. This image of the mythical Christian ruler Prester John is a detail from an atlas created in the late 1550s by the Portuguese mapmaker Diogo Homem. Credit: East Africa with Prester John enthroned by British Library /Wikimedia Commons, public domain. The Portuguese also hoped to gain access to the wealth of Africa. As they moved southward along the continent's coast, they established citadels on land leased from local rulers, like the fortress of Elmina, located on the coast of present-day Ghana. From there, they bartered for gold, ivory, and enslaved people. The first shipment of enslaved Africans arrived in Portugal in 1441. To further its economic interests, Portugal also established relations with the African kingdoms of Benin and Congo. Its connection to Congo, in what is now Angola, was particularly close. Members of Congo's ruling family and nobility converted to Roman Catholicism and adopted Portuguese names. Congo became an important source of enslaved laborers, and its kings readily assisted the Portuguese in taking captives from enemy tribes. The Portuguese claim to the riches of African trade was affirmed in 1455 in the Romanes Pontifex, a papal decree issued by Pope Nicholas V that granted Portugal exclusive rights to trade in Africa south of Cape Bojador, on the coast of Morocco. The interests of the Africans who controlled these lands were not considered. Spanish exploration. Despite the Romanes Pontifex, the Spanish monarchs Isabella I of Castile and Ferdinand II of Aragon were not willing to allow Portugal to take the lead in establishing maritime trade with places outside Europe. By 1492, the final Muslim stronghold on the Iberian Peninsula had been defeated, and no longer worried about the threat posed by the Muslim presence, Isabella and Ferdinand could turn to matters beyond the peninsula. In 1486, the Genoese navigator Christopher Columbus approached them with a request for funds for exploration. Columbus proposed that he could reach Asia by sailing westward across the Atlantic Ocean. Eager to find an all-water route to Asia to compete with the Portuguese, Isabella and Ferdinand agreed to his request. Like the Portuguese monarchs, they were also dedicated to spreading Christianity and combating the spread of Islam. Indeed, they regarded themselves as Europe's foremost defenders of Roman Catholicism. On August 3, 1492, Columbus set sail from Spain with 3 ships. After stopping briefly in the Canary Islands, he set off again on September 6. 5 weeks later, he reached the Bahamas, which he believed were a part of Southeast Asia called the Indies. From there, he sailed to Cuba and an island Columbus named Hispaniola, meaning Little Spain. The island now divided between the Dominican Republic and Haiti. Columbus made contact with the inhabitants of Hispaniola, whom he called Indians. Some welcomed the Europeans, who attempted to learn whether the inhabitants had gold, but one group, perhaps mistrusting the newcomers, engaged them in battle. Leaving behind a handful of men to found a settlement on Hispaniola, Columbus and his crew departed for Europe, taking with them some Arawak people they had kidnapped. They arrived in Spain in 1493, with Columbus believing he had succeeded in reaching the Indies. He returned to the Americas 3 more times, figure 510. On the 3rd voyage, he explored the coast of Venezuela, which he was certain was part of the Asian mainland. A map of the world is drawn with North America, South America, Europe, Asia, Africa, the Pacific Ocean, Atlantic Ocean, and Indian Ocean labeled. There are 4 arced arrows pointing west from the westernmost tip of Europe in Spain across the Atlantic Ocean to various places in Central America. The map legend shows the colored lines and what they stand for. The red arrow is labeled 1492, 1493, first voyage, and ends on the northern coast of Cuba. The orange arrow is labeled 1493, 1496, second voyage, and ends on the western coast of Cuba. The blue arrow is labeled 1498, 1500, third voyage, and runs along the southern coast of Cuba before turning south and ending at Panama. The green arrow is labeled 1502, 1504, fourth voyage, and swoops southward along the western coast of Africa before turning back north, brushing the northeastern coast of South America and ending at the southern coast of Haiti. Figure 5.10 The Voyages of Columbus. Christopher Columbus made 4 voyages between 1492 and 1504, all to the Caribbean. He continued to believe he had found a route to Asia. Attribution. Copyright Rice University, OpenStax, under CC by 40 license. The past meets the present. Columbus Day versus Indigenous Peoples Day. Local governments across the United States have recently begun replacing the federal holiday honoring Christopher Columbus with one honoring the role of indigenous peoples in the nation's past and present. South Dakota began the trend as far back as 1989, but Columbus's place in history remains controversial. While some believe he should be honored, others, including many Native Americans, believe that as a known enslaver of Africans and Native Americans, he should not be glorified. The adoption of Columbus as the original American son, who discovered America, was once meant to humanize immigrants and minority populations, particularly Italian Catholics who had come to the northeastern United States in the late 1800s. Columbus was Italian and Catholic, but at the same time, the U.S. government continued to exile indigenous peoples from their homelands and suppress their religion and culture. Many historians also argue that Columbus opened the door not just to European settlement, but also to disease, oppression, and genocide. The debate about whether the holiday named for him is culturally insensitive continues. How might the continued celebration of Columbus Day affect indigenous communities? How should U.S. citizens decide whether and how to change federal holidays? Who should or should not be honored by such holidays? Why? Soon, however, Europeans came to realize that the lands Columbus had found were new continents, which were then named the Americas after the Italian mapmaker Amerigo Vespucci, who accompanied later Spanish and Portuguese voyages to South America. This was the beginning of European colonialism in the Americas. Colonialism is a practice in which one group of people attempts to establish control over another, usually for purposes of economic exploitation. The lands in the Americas to which the Spanish, Portuguese, and other European nations laid claim in the 15th and 16th centuries were incorporated into the colonial empires these countries were beginning to build. Columbus's expeditions did not produce the riches the Spanish monarchs had hoped for. Nevertheless, Spain's exploration of the new continents continued, led by conquistadors. Some of these explorers were nobles or had military training and had fought against the Muslims in Spain. Others were landless and wished to improve their lot in life. One instrument by which the Spanish government compensated conquistadors was the encomienda, a hereditary grant that entitled the holder, called an encomendero, to the labor of a specified number of conquered people, or to a tribute of precious metals or agricultural produce. Although the Crown forbade the enslavement of indigenous peoples, the encomienda system enabled their abuse at the hands of Spanish settlers who hoped to profit from their labor. Figure 511. A drawing shows a bearded man in a black, long coat and hat, brown pants, and a red robe holding a stick in his hand on a plain background. He has a sword at his side. He holds the black hair of a man in a loincloth on the ground. The man's face is bleeding as well as his back. A string from the man's black hat shows a brick and a hand holding long, thin items. There is scripted writing on the top left of the drawing. Figure 5. 11 abuses under the encomienda system. This image is from the Codex Tepetlaestoc, also known as the Codex Kingsborough, a 16th century pictorial account by an indigenous chronicler. It shows a Spanish encomienda holder beating an indigenous man. The image was used as evidence in a lawsuit brought by indigenous workers against the encomenderos. Credit: an indigenous Mexican complaint against an abusive encomendero, by Codex Kingsborough/Wikimedia Commons, public domain. The great prizes the Spanish hoped to find were soon discovered in Mexico. In 1519, the conquistador Hernán Cortés landed at Patanchen on the Yucatan Peninsula and marched north to the interior of Mexico, where he encountered the powerful Aztec Empire. The wealth of the Aztecs and the sophistication of their capital city of Tenochtitlan dazzled the Spanish. At first, the Aztec Emperor Moctezuma II welcomed them and presented them with gifts. Cortés, however, took Moctezuma prisoner and used him as a puppet to attempt to control his people. Conflict erupted in 1520 when the Spanish killed participants in an Aztec religious ritual, and the residents of Tenochtitlan attacked the conquistadors. In the chaos, Moctezuma II was killed, possibly by his own people who felt he had betrayed them, and the Spanish, facing destruction, fled Tenochtitlan for the nearby city of Tlaxcala, a rival of Tenochtitlan, figure 5. 12. A black and white drawing shows a tall, bearded man in robes and armor surrounded by three people on his right in long coats and hats. One person behind him is dressed in a flowy outfit and hat. Two people to his left are shown in feathery skirts and robes with ornate head dressings. The one in front has both arms extended out in front of him. Stairs in the background lead up into a draped doorway. Tapestries hang in the back and behind the people. Figure 5. 12. Moctezuma II. This engraving by 17th-century artist Jan Carol Donatus van Beek depicts Hernán Cortés ordering the imprisonment of the Aztec Emperor Moctezuma II, seen at the right wearing a feather headdress and cape. Moctezuma died in Spanish custody, but it is unknown whether the Spanish or the Aztecs killed him. Credit: modification of work, Moctezuma imprisoned by Cortés, copperplate engraving from Van Beek. By illustrations de Histoire de la Conquête du Mexique ou de la Nouvelle Espagne, Gallica BNF/Wikimedia Commons, public domain. In their own words, massacre in the temple. The Aztecs rose against the Spanish following their attack on worshippers at an Aztec religious ritual at the Great Temple in Tenochtitlan. One of the gods to be honored there was Huitzilopochtli, a god of war. The uprising was briefly successful, and the Spanish were temporarily driven from the city. The following excerpt is an Aztec account of the Spanish attack. During this time, the people asked Moctezuma how they should celebrate their god's fiesta. He said, "Dress him in all his finery, in all his sacred ornaments." During this same time, the Spaniards hanged a chief from Acalhuacan named Nezahualcoyotl. They also murdered the king of Nautla, Cohualpapacatzin, by wounding him with arrows and then burning him alive. For this reason, our warriors were on guard at the Eagle Gate, but messengers came to tell them to dress the figure of Huitzilopochtli. They left their posts and went to dress him in his sacred finery, his ornaments and his paper clothing. When this had been done, the celebrants began to sing their songs. That is how they celebrated the first day of the fiesta. On the second day they began to sing again, but without warning they were all put to death. The dancers and singers were completely unarmed. The Spaniards attacked the musicians first, slashing at their hands and faces until they had killed all of them. The singers, and even the spectators, were also killed. This slaughter in the sacred patio went on for 3 hours. Then the Spaniards burst into the rooms of the temple to kill the others, those who were carrying water, or bringing fodder for the horses, or grinding meal, or sweeping, or standing watch over this work. The king Moctezuma, who was accompanied by those who had brought food for the Spaniards, protested, "Our lords, that is enough. What are you doing? These people are not carrying shields. Our lords, they are completely unarmed." Miguel Leon Portilla, The Broken Spears, the Aztec account of the conquest of Mexico. What may have motivated this attack? Why might the Spanish have chosen to attack people at a religious festival? Do the Aztecs seem to have had any idea of what was going to happen? Explain your answer. Cortés and his Tlaxcalan allies returned to Tenochtitlan in May 1521. By this time, the Aztecs were beginning to suffer from infectious diseases brought by the Spanish. Smallpox was a likely culprit, but other diseases may have been spreading as well. For example, evidence exists that an outbreak of salmonella in 1540 also took many Aztec lives. Badly weakened, the Aztecs could not defeat Cortés and his indigenous allies. After a siege of 3 months, Tenochtitlan fell to the Spanish, who began converting the Aztecs to Christianity. Although some Aztecs converted voluntarily, many were forced. Aztec temples were destroyed, and Catholic churches were built on top of them. The Spanish renamed Tenochtitlan Mexico City, and it became the capital of the colony of New Spain. The colony eventually provided Spanish monarchs with the wealth they craved in the form of rich silver deposits. Cortés's exploits in Mexico were soon matched by those of another Spanish adventurer, Francisco Pizarro, who conquered the Inca Empire in South America. In January 1530, Pizarro sailed from the Canary Islands on an expedition to conquer Peru, which he had heard was rich in precious metals. His conquest had been authorized in 1529 by Queen Isabella of Portugal, the wife of Holy Roman Emperor Charles V, who was also King of Spain. The Inca ruler had recently died of smallpox, and rival heirs to the throne were at war. Pizarro took advantage of the chaos and the fact that the Inca forces had been depleted by years of fighting. In 1532, he captured Atahualpa, one of the parties in the Civil War. The following year, the Spanish executed him, despite his promises to fill an entire room with gold and 2 with silver if Pizarro set him free. Pizarro then seized control of Cusco, the Inca capital. Peru, which like Mexico had extensive silver deposits, was reduced to a Spanish colony. The Inca did not passively accept Spanish rule. Under the leader Manco Inca, about 100,000 Incas lay siege to Cusco in 1536. They lacked the gunpowder weapons of the Spanish, however, and could not drive the Europeans out. The Spanish divided the Inca Empire into 4 regions, each with a Spanish governor, and Pizarro was given the territory that corresponds to the modern country of Peru. The Treaty of Tordesillas. Word of Columbus's discoveries on behalf of the Spanish alarmed and angered the Portuguese. Under the terms of the 1479 Treaty of Alcasovas, Portugal had renounced any claim to the Spanish throne and granted Spain control of the Canary Islands. In exchange, Portugal received the coast of Guinea in Africa, which was rich in gold, and all islands in the Atlantic south of the Canaries. This included not only those territories Portugal already controlled, Madeira, the Azores, and Cape Verde, but also any that might be discovered in the future. In 1481, the Pope also issued a decree that granted Portugal territories in the Atlantic. Spain's claim to the Caribbean islands Columbus had explored thus seemed to violate both the treaty and the Pope's decree. The Portuguese king announced his intention to send an armed fleet to take control of them. Unable to challenge Portugal's dominance at sea, Isabella and Ferdinand asked Pope Alexander VI to intercede. The Pope, who was Spanish, decreed that all lands belonged to Spain that fell west of a line drawn 100 leagues west of any of the Azores and Cape Verde Islands. Portugal accordingly began negotiations with Spain, which consented to move the line dividing Spanish from Portuguese possessions farther to the west. The new line cut across the eastern bulge of the South American continent, now part of Brazil, but left the rest of the Americas to Spain. This agreement, the Treaty of Tordesillas, was signed in 1494 and endorsed in 1506 by a decree of Pope Julius II, figure 513. Thus, when the explorer Pedro Alvarez Cabral landed on the eastern coast of South America in 1500, he was able to claim it for Portugal. A historical map shows South and North America, Europe on the right and China on the left. Locations are labeled. Mountains are indicated on the land, and rivers are drawn. A red line labeled equinoctial crosses horizontally through the top portion of South America, cutting the map in half. Another red line runs vertically in the right fifth of the map, running through a bit of North America and the very eastern portion of South America. The lines intersect on the north coast of Brazil. Words at the top read, Description de las Indias Occidentales. Figure 513 Treaty of Tordesillas. This Spanish map from 1622 shows in red the vertical dividing line described in the Treaty of Tordesillas. It cuts north to south through the Atlantic Ocean and across the eastern portion of Brazil. All land to the right of the line was deemed to belong to Portugal, and all land to the left to Spain. Credit. Map of meridian line set under the Treaty of Tordesillas by Library of Congress/Wikimedia Commons, public domain. By the time Cabral made landfall in Brazil in 1500, Portuguese sailors had already rounded the Cape of Good Hope at the tip of southern Africa and sailed up that continent's eastern coast and on to India. Hoping to lay claim to the riches of Asia, Spain then argued that the line dividing the Atlantic continued to the other side of the globe, bisecting the Pacific and giving the Spanish the right to territories in Asia as well. Portugal objected and turned to the Vatican again for help. In 1514, Pope Leo X declared that the line described in the Treaty of Tordesillas allocated territories in the Atlantic, but not the Pacific. Spain had no claim to the lands of Asia. Spain renewed its argument in 1522 when an expeditionary fleet that had been captained by Ferdinand Magellan returned to Europe after circumnavigating the globe. Magellan had been in the employ of Spain when he found a means of reaching Asia by sailing around the southern tip of South America. The expedition had reached the Maluku Islands, or the Moluccas, in modern Indonesia, the source of valuable spices, and Spain wished to claim this territory, which Portugal had already explored in 1512. To settle their claims to the islands, in 1529 Portugal and Spain signed the Treaty of Zaragoza, dividing the Pacific Ocean between them. The treaty awarded the Maluku Islands to Portugal with the understanding that should Spain wish to claim them it could, but it would have to compensate Portugal for its loss. Spain did not have the money to do so, and this fact, along with a convenient marriage of the Spanish and Portuguese kings to one another's sisters, led Spain to abandon its claim to the Moluccas. In the treaties of Zaragoza and Tordesillas, two of the world's nations divided the globe between them, never questioning their right to do so and turning repeatedly to the Pope to give God's sanction to their claims. Unsurprisingly, however, the world's other nations ignored both treaties. England and the Netherlands, which had become Protestant nations during the Reformation, felt no need to abide by papal decrees, nor did France, though it remained Roman Catholic. As the French King Francis I explained, "The sun shines for me as it does for others." As the fortunes of Spain and Portugal declined in the 17th century, England, France, and the Netherlands claimed territory in Asia and the Americas and established their own trading posts on the African coast. Spain and Portugal also failed to acknowledge the rights of the indigenous peoples in the lands they claimed. Indeed, many Europeans believed that by conquering the inhabitants of the Americas and giving them no choice but to convert to Christianity, they were saving their souls. The Columbian Exchange. The impact of Portuguese and Spanish exploration and settlement went far beyond the political and economic implications. The so-called Columbian Exchange began with the first contact between native peoples and Christopher Columbus in the Caribbean in 1492. This phrase refers to the back-and-forth flow of plants, animals, and diseases between the eastern and western hemispheres. Far more than physical products were traded, however. Ideas, religious practices, enslaved peoples, and cultural traditions also crossed the Atlantic to reshape, blend, and sometimes destroy various civilizations in the process. The world into which Columbus stepped in 1492 was just as complex, diverse, and dangerous as the one he left behind. In the Americas, empires rose and fell, people married and raised families, individuals sought to better their lives by moving and innovating. But key differences shaped the collisions to come. One of the most fundamental was the perception of human nature and human origins. For Europeans, the world, its history, and its progression were linear. Just as the Christian Bible described, in the beginning there was darkness. Then God created light along with the world, and one day that world would come to an end. This belief influenced Europeans' perception that time progressed in a straight line along which humans were always moving forward. All things had a beginning, a point or climax, and an ending. But for many indigenous peoples, The world was cyclical and infinite. The Aztecs, for example, believed that the world in which they lived was but the latest in a series of worlds that had been created and destroyed. Their world would continue to exist only so long as they fed the sun with the blood of sacrificial victims. In indigenous concepts of the cosmos, no hard separations existed between humans and nature, or between spiritual and human realms. Many religious belief systems were animistic, meaning the spiritual world resided not just in humans, but also in animals, plants, and even rocks. This belief was very different from monotheism, in which all spiritual power resided in one single divine being. Indigenous religions did not focus on sin or on the nature of good and evil. Instead, the spiritual world was a place full of power that humans could harness for either good or evil. Though their specific beliefs varied widely, all indigenous groups in the Western Hemisphere held these basic views about their existence and their relationship to others and to the world. Like humans, animals, and plants, the earth possessed sacred power. Therefore, it could not be owned. The concept of owning land seemed nonsensical to many indigenous groups, and their corresponding lack of emphasis on private property was one reason Europeans sometimes found it easy to lay claim to lands inhabited by native peoples. Indigenous Americans also differed from Europeans of the 1400s in their approach to gender. While indigenous women did complete some of the same tasks as European women, such as cooking, making clothing, and raising children, they also took part in activities that Europeans believed should be done by men, and that in Europe usually were. For example, in many indigenous societies, women were the principal farmers and built the family's dwelling. In many groups, women were revered as imbued with sacred powers to heal and to create. This power also gave them a strong voice in the leadership of their communities, and in some of these, women sat on tribal councils. Among the Iroquois of North America, for example, women often attended tribal councils to advise male clan representatives, and women chose the tribe's male leaders. Among the Wampanoag of southern New England, women could serve as tribal leaders. In many tribes, individuals who did not accept the roles traditionally assigned to people of their sex had far more freedom to live as they desired than did such people in Europe. Women who wished to live as men and men who wished to live and dress, as women did not necessarily face punishment or maltreatment, as long as they contributed to society in other ways. For example, in some societies, women became hunters and warriors. In many societies, men who felt they had been born with the souls of women dressed as women, pursued women's occupations, and became the second or third wives of other men. Such men were often regarded as possessing great spiritual power and were treated with respect. When Columbus arrived, the indigenous population of the entire Western Hemisphere likely numbered around 75 million, compared to Europe's population of probably around 70 million. Although historians' estimates vary greatly. Indigenous peoples made up more than 600 groups or tribes in North America alone. Some, such as the Inuit and the Dene, were mostly hunter-gatherers in cold climates inhospitable to farming. Others farther south, such as the Puebloans and the Creek, farmed extensively, growing maize as the staple of their food economies. These groups often adopted political organizations practical for their environment. Hunter-gatherers such as the Apache lived as small bands of unified family units with a designated leader. Among township societies such as the Iroquois, groups of towns joined to form political confederacies. In the Aztec and Inca empires, large urban populations were ruled by monarchs. As part of the Columbian Exchange, Europeans introduced to the Americas the crops they were familiar with at home, including wheat, the Vitis vinifera species of grape, fruits such as pears, peaches, and many varieties of apples, and vegetables such as onions and garlic. The first two were especially important for the Spanish and Portuguese. Wheat was needed to make the communion wafers that were a necessary part of the Roman Catholic Mass, and European grapes were needed to make wine for the same ceremony. For the most part, Native Americans had little interest in adopting European foods, but the arrival of non-edible resources created an immediate impact. Metal cookware and metal weaponry gave great power to those who chose to adopt them. European, Asian, and African societies also changed as new plant life was brought eastward across the Atlantic. Indigenous peoples in North America had relied on maize corn for thousands of years, and varieties of potatoes, including sweet potatoes, had long been staples among indigenous peoples in South America. Along with these foods, tomatoes, chili peppers, vanilla, manioc, pineapples, and peanuts were introduced to and became culinary staples of nations in Europe, Africa, and Asia. Chocolate, which had been consumed in liquid form by the Aztec and the Maya, and tobacco, another product from the Americas, became especially popular in Europe. Figure 514. The drawing shows a barefoot woman in a long, striped dress with colorful trim. She holds a container high in the air with both arms and pours a brown liquid from it into a brown container with red drawings located on the floor at her feet. Figure 514. Chocolate. Chocolate was one of the most popular crops introduced from the Americas to the rest of the world. In this image from the Tudela Codex, created c. 1553, an Aztec woman pours liquefied chocolate from one container into another to make it frothy. Credit: Mujer Versionado Chocolate, Codex Tudela by Museo de America / Wikimedia Commons, public domain. Link to learning. Read How the Chili Pepper Conquered China. To learn about the far-reaching effects on China of the introduction of chilies from the Americas. Coffee and sugar cane, introduced to the Americas by Europeans, grew exceedingly well in the tropical climates of the Caribbean, Central America, South America, and the southernmost portions of North America. The widespread adoption of these foods in the rest of the world began a chain reaction of increased demand for them and for agricultural labor. This need for labor eventually led to the plantation-style slavery that took hold in parts of the United States, islands in the Caribbean, and areas of South America such as Brazil. Plant life was not the only item exchanged across the Atlantic. A variety of animals accompanied Europeans as they journeyed across the ocean and back. Horses, cows, goats, sheep, pigs, and chickens all made the Atlantic crossing to the Americas. These animals transformed the life of many indigenous communities. In North America, tribes such as the Lakota moved onto the Great Plains and created a way of life based on hunting bison following their adoption of the horse. The Navajo became sheep herders and expert weavers of woolen textiles. Tribes in Mexico and Central and South America began to raise chickens and goats, which provided valuable sources of protein. Deadly pathogens also made the crossing to the Americas and caused one of the worst disease-based disasters in history. Given limited understanding of epidemic science, no one realized that native peoples had virtually none of the resistance and immunity Europeans had developed to infectious diseases, because the animals that originally spawned them, and from which they had jumped to humans, simply did not exist in the Americas. Figure 515. When these diseases were brought by Europeans and the enslaved Africans who often accompanied them, native peoples without natural immunity who contracted them experienced a death rate that some scholars estimate was as high as 95%. A drawing is divided into 2 sections on the left side and 3 sections on the right. The top left section shows a person with spots all over their body sitting, wrapped in a blanket. A person sits across from them in a long shirt and is shown coughing. In the bottom left section, a person covered with a blanket with spots all over their body is laying on a bed and is shown coughing. In the right top section, a person with spots all over their body is shown laying on a bed completely covered in a blanket. In the middle picture, a similar person is shown partially uncovered, and in the bottom section is shown halfway uncovered. Figure 5:15, the spread of disease in the Americas. This 15th century image from the Florentine Codex captures the misery experienced by the indigenous peoples of Mexico following the spread of infectious disease. Credit: Florentine Codex BK 12F54 Smallpox by Biblioteca Medicia Lorenziana, Florence/Wikimedia Commons, public domain. Lack of exposure to European livestock or European diseases is not the sole reason the indigenous peoples of the Americas died in such large numbers, however. Smallpox, typhus, measles, bubonic plague, influenza, salmonella, and other diseases took the lives of millions of people throughout the Americas because of the destruction wrought by Europeans. European settlers often allowed their livestock to roam loose, and these animals, especially hogs, wreaked havoc on the crops planted by indigenous peoples. In places where the Spanish conducted slave raids, indigenous people often went into hiding, refusing to venture out to farm, fish, or tend their fields for fear of being captured. The resulting malnutrition weakened their immune systems, making it harder for them to fight off infectious diseases, even those with which their bodies were familiar. In heavily settled, densely populated regions, infectious diseases spread rapidly. Bodies weakened by one disease easily succumbed to subsequent infections. Other factors also contributed to depopulation across the Western continents. Groups intent on colonizing, such as the Spanish in New Spain, wanted to establish economies that exported wealth and materials to the home country. To that end, the infrastructure they built intentionally depleted local environments and deprived indigenous peoples of the natural resources within their lands, including fertile soil, water, timber, and precious metals. When indigenous populations did not accept these economic conditions, they were met with violence against themselves and their families. Given violence, exile, enslavement, and a high death rate from disease, the original inhabitants of the Western Hemisphere experienced a cataclysm during the 16th century. They still resisted European incursions, however, beginning a centuries-long struggle with echoes in the present day. Within a few months of his exploring the Caribbean region, for example, native leaders began directing Columbus to other islands, deflecting the negative consequences that followed the arrival of Europeans. Sometimes indigenous groups chose violence to resist European violence. Not all indigenous peoples reacted with violence, however. During the often brutal colonization of the Western Hemisphere, many systems of gender, religious beliefs, and societal organization that existed in the Americas did collapse, while others merged or changed, creating new hybrid societies across the American continents and the Caribbean islands. But many indigenous groups chose to incorporate facets of European material culture, such as tools and weapons, into their own in ways that allowed for their survival. For example, the Comanche, a largely hunter-gatherer group, adopted the Spanish horses brought by the conquistadors, figure 516. Within a few generations, the combination of horses and metal weaponry transformed the Comanche into an empire that negotiated as equals with the Spanish, the British, and the French. A painting shows 3 American Indians with feathers in their hair and brown pants, with feathers up and down the sides riding on horses on a green hilly area. 2 of them use a bow and arrow to shoot at bison, while the third is holding a long spear. The bison run throughout the grassy mountains. One bison in front has an arrow in his side and is bleeding as he runs. Figure 5:16 hunting bison on horseback. In this 1844 hand-colored lithograph by George Catlin, North American Plains Indians pursue bison on horseback. Before the arrival of horses with the Spanish, a life on the Great Plains based entirely on the hunting of bison had not been possible. Credit: Buffalo Hunt by Catlin's North American Indian Portfolio / Wikimedia Commons, public domain. Finally, Not all Atlantic commerce and settlement flowed from east to west. Indigenous people also took advantage of the Columbian exchange and traveled to Europe seeking ways to help themselves and their people. By the 17th century, dozens of indigenous negotiators had gone to Europe to appeal directly to the monarchs for aid and for military and economic benefits. Their efforts reveal the ways in which indigenous groups all over the Atlantic world hope to shape their future on their own terms. Learning objectives. By the end of this section, you will be able to describe the theory of mercantilism, explain the role of colonies in mercantilism, identify the major criticisms of mercantilism, the success of Spain and Portugal in establishing settlements in the Americas, and more importantly, the profits they derived from those settlements, inspired other European nations to emulate them. The English, French, and Dutch all ventured across the Atlantic with the goal of founding colonies, whose resources they could exploit in order to dominate rival powers. The rise of mercantilism. Much European exploration was driven by an economic theory known as mercantilism, a name given to the theory by later historians. According to this theory, a nation's power depended on the amount of gold and silver it held. The wealthier the nation, the larger the armies and navies it could support in its conflicts with rival powers. Amassing national wealth, in turn, depended on maintaining a favorable balance of trade, a situation in which a country exports goods of greater value than it imports. Mercantilism also assumed that the world's wealth as measured in gold and silver was finite, so a gain for one nation was a loss for another. To surpass other nations in power, a country must possess more gold and silver than others. According to mercantilism, there could be only one victor in economic competition. When a nation sold goods abroad, it accumulated gold and silver, but when it imported foreign products, it had to transfer gold and silver to other nations as payment. Thus, at the heart of mercantilism lay the need for a nation to maximize its exports and minimize its imports. Indeed, the ideal was to import nothing and produce everything in the home country, including agricultural produce. A nation that could not supply all its own needs should import raw materials, transform them into finished products, and sell them abroad for more money than it had cost to produce them. Any raw materials a nation possessed should be reserved for domestic manufacturing. In the 16th and 17th centuries, mercantilist theory was embraced by most European nations, especially France and England. Perhaps as much as religious fervor and a thirst for knowledge, this premise drove exploration and the establishment of colonies. Mercantilists believed a colonial empire was necessary for economic domination. Colonies could supply raw materials for domestic consumption, so there was no need to purchase these resources from others. Colonial populations, in turn, provided a ready market for goods made in the home country. To ensure that colonies added to their national wealth, European countries that established them usually required that they trade only with the home country. Thus, for example, England's colonies in North America could sell what they produced only in England. Most mercantilist theorists believed government regulation of the economy was necessary to maximize wealth. Governments commonly prohibited certain imports to prevent them from competing with domestic industry. In 1539, for example, to protect domestic textile manufacturing, France banned the import of goods made of wool. Governments also imposed high tariffs or taxes on imported goods. These made foreign products more expensive and thus promoted development of a nation's own industries. Governments might also grant firms monopolies over certain kinds of domestic production, establish and provide financial support for certain industries to ensure domestic self-sufficiency, and pay for internal improvements, such as new roads, to promote domestic manufacturing and commerce. They also maintained large navies to protect international trade and defend foreign colonies. France provides perhaps the preeminent example of the mercantilist theory in practice. France was an absolute monarchy. Absolute monarchies appeared in Europe in the 16th and 17th centuries as feudalism declined and new countries arose from medieval kingdoms. These new nation-states were characterized by centralized administrations and codified laws. They were guarded by professional standing armies, not noble vassals at the head of their own private armies. At the head of the state stood a monarch, usually a king, who claimed a divine right to rule. The medieval concept of monarchy had regarded kings as subservient to the pope, but absolute monarchs considered themselves subordinate to no one. They could rule as they wished with no need to confer with or seek the consent of others, or to share power with the noble class as medieval monarchs had done. Absolute monarchs proclaimed their own laws, formulated foreign policy, administered justice, or appointed those who did so, and imposed taxes as they wished. They were the sole source of authority in their lands and often took steps to weaken the power of their nobles so they did not pose a threat to their rule. The most powerful of the absolute monarchies was France, and Louis XIV, who became King of France in 1643, was the epitome of a divine right monarch. Unwilling to share power with the higher-ranked members of the French nobility, who had been responsible for numerous revolts against the French monarchy in the decades before he came to the throne, Louis deprived them of any role in governing or administering the state. He required that they live with him at his magnificent palace in Versailles, where they were invited to spend their time and money, which might otherwise have been used to plot revolts, in putting on displays of ostentatious living and competing with one another for the king's favor that might mean they were allowed to hold the king's shirt as he dressed in the morning. All state matters were rigorously scrutinized by Louis, and he spent hours planning troop movements, overseeing the building of roads and canals, and promulgating legal codes for France's colonies. "L'État c'est moi. I am the state," he once famously proclaimed. France's absolute monarchy made it possible for the nation to regulate economic life as countries with less powerful rulers and less centralized governments could not. France embraced mercantilism under the guidance of Jean-Baptiste Colbert, who became Louis XIV's chief minister in 1661. As the Controller General of Finances, Colbert sought to promote French manufacturing and foreign trade and decrease imports. Under his direction, the government increased tariffs on foreign-made goods and completely banned the importation of some such as lace. Colbert established royal manufacturing and glassworks and granted private companies monopolies on lace manufacture. Figure 5. 17. Reasoning that the higher the quality of a product, the more could be charged for it, Colbert enacted strict quality control standards so French products would bring high prices overseas, and he punished those who tried to avoid these regulations. To increase the government's wealth, he also sought to tax the French nobility, though unsuccessfully. A drawing shows the inside of a very large, long room with a carved ceiling and tapestry-decorated walls. On the left are 11 statues of people on pedestals placed between tall windows. The statues show people in various cloths draped over their bodies. Women in long petticoat dresses and men in long coats, robes, and hats stand around talking with each other and pointing out items across the room. 2 dogs are shown in the room at the bottom. On the right of the drawing, suspended from the top of the wall, is a very large tapestry which people on both sides are pulling up with ropes. Curtains are shown hanging across the ceiling. Across the bottom, a crest is displayed and words are written. Figure 5. 17. Protecting domestic industry under mercantilism. Under King Louis XIV and his chief minister Jean-Baptiste Colbert, the Gobelins Fine Furnishings Factory began operating on behalf of the Crown in 1662. This etching from a few years later shows Colbert visiting the factory's tapestry-making operation. Credit: Colbert visiting the Gobelins by Metropolitan Museum of Art, Harris Brisbane Dick Fund, 1953/Wikimedia Commons, CC 01. 0. Colbert established a merchant marine to carry French goods abroad for trade, reducing the nation's reliance on ships from other countries. By ensuring that the pay for transporting these goods went to the ships, French captains and owners, he helped to keep wealth within the nation. Because the merchant marine could be called upon in time of war, Colbert had thus also strengthened France's ability to engage in armed conflict with foreign powers. Mercantilist theory influenced England and the Netherlands too. Although England's parliament did not exert as much control over its economy as the monarchy exerted in France, it nevertheless took steps to promote English trade and discourage the importation of foreign goods. Tariffs were placed on foreign products, and in the second half of the 17th century, laws were passed requiring that all ships bringing goods to England have English owners and a predominantly English crew. The Dutch adopted the mercantilist strategy of exporting high-quality goods, especially cloth, iron tools, and guns, to make up for the money the resource-poor country spent on raw materials supplied by other nations. Like France, both England and the Netherlands granted monopolies on foreign trade to private companies, the British East India Company and the Dutch East India Company. The purpose was to prevent competition among merchants that might drive up the prices they were willing to pay for foreign goods, and drive down the prices they charged for domestic goods sold abroad. To increase their access to raw materials and establish new markets for their goods, the Dutch, English, and French, noting the success of Spain and Portugal, also set out to establish colonies in the Americas. A colonial empire seemed essential to securing national wealth and power, mercantilism, and the expansion of empire. To compete with Spain and Portugal, their rivals England, France, and the Netherlands soon founded communities in North America. England established colonies on the mainland of North America in the 16th century, and by the middle of the 18th century, they stretched from Newfoundland to Georgia, figure 518. Besides tobacco, they supplied England with a variety of goods ranging from timber, furs, and salted fish from the northern colonies to rice, indigo, and deer hides from the south. The colonies attracted many landless, unemployed young European men and women, too, who traveled to North America as indentured servants, bound by a contract to work for an agreed-upon number of years. After the landowner who paid for their passage had been compensated by their years of labor, indentured servants received their freedom and typically a grant of land as well. A map of North America, the Arctic Ocean, and the northwest portion of South America is shown, along with the Pacific and Atlantic Oceans, an area along the Atlantic coast of the U.S. From the Gulf of Maine, down through Virginia by the Chesapeake Bay and into land labeled Carolina, is highlighted pink as territory controlled by Great Britain. Splitting the pink area is a very small sliver south of the Gulf of Maine, labeled New Netherlands, and highlighted purple as territory controlled by the Netherlands. West of the pink and purple areas is a large portion of North America highlighted green from the Labrador Sea in Canada, including Newfoundland, Acadia, New France, and New England. It runs south to the Gulf of Mexico and west to the middle of the U.S. and is labeled territory controlled by France. This territory also includes the western half of Santo Domingo, all of Central America stretching up into a portion of the U.S., labeled New Spain, along with Florida, Cuba, and the eastern portion of the island of Santo Domingo in the Caribbean Sea is highlighted orange as territory controlled by Spain. Figure 5, 18 Europe's footprint in the Americas. By the early 17th century, Spain, Portugal, England, France, and the Netherlands all had established colonies in the Americas. Spain's empire was the largest. Credit. Modification of work, Map of North America in 1750. By Bill of Rights Institute /Flickr, CC by 40. France and the Netherlands also founded colonies in North America. In 1535, Jacques Cartier claimed Canada, also called New France. In the name of King Francis I, like England, France was unable to maintain a permanent settlement in North America until the 17th century, when Samuel de Champlain founded one at Quebec. The French established further settlements in what is now the state of Maine, on the southern coast of Newfoundland, and in Louisiana, named for King Louis XIV. Animal hides and furs were the main exports to France. A small Dutch colony also briefly flourished in what is now New York and New Jersey before it was ceded to England in 1664. Like the French, the Dutch colonists of New Netherlands were primarily engaged in the fur trade, although many Dutch farmers also settled in the Hudson Valley, in New Jersey, and on Long Island. Link to learning. Although Spain, Portugal, England, France, the Netherlands, and Denmark were the major countries that established colonies in the Americas between the 15th and 17th centuries, they were not the only ones. At the historic UK website, learn about the Darien scheme that was Scotland's unsuccessful attempt to found a colony in Central America in 1698. The European nations intended to extract the greatest possible wealth from their mainland colonies in the form of raw materials such as hides, furs, and agricultural products. France controlled immigration to Canada to ensure that its population remained limited to fur trappers and traders, a small number of farmers to provide them with food, and soldiers to guard them. In 1627, the French government granted a monopoly over the fur trade to the Company of New France. All fur trappers in Canada were to either work directly for the company or sell their furs to it. Traders had to pay the government a 25% sales tax. In 1663, Louis XIV placed the company under royal control. Spain exercised the strictest control over colonial commerce. Trade was limited to only a few ports in the Spanish colonies and the port of Seville in Spain, and 2 trading fleets departed from Seville bound for the Americas each year. The Spanish government forbade trade at other times. In addition, those seeking to engage in trade had to procure a license to do so, at considerable expense. The Spanish government also held a number of monopolies, such as one on all silver produced in its colonies, as well as owning all the mercury produced in the colony of Peru. Spanish colonies that needed mercury, which was used for processing the gold and silver they mined, had to purchase it from Peru. Although the mainland colonies yielded wealth for the European home countries, the chief prizes were the islands of the Caribbean where sugar could be grown. Over the course of the 17th century, England, France, and the Netherlands set up colonies throughout the Caribbean on islands either not claimed by Spain or taken from it. The 3 attempted to found colonies in Central or South America as well, but Spanish and Portuguese dominance there either made these efforts unsuccessful, like the Dutch attempts in Brazil, or they kept the colonies small, such as French Guiana and Dutch Guiana, now Suriname. Mercantilism and its critics. Although European merchants and government ministers enthusiastically relied on mercantilist theory in the building of colonial empires, mercantilism also had many critics. 18th-century Scottish philosopher David Hume argued that as more gold circulated in a country's economy, prices would rise, eventually becoming so high that no one would purchase goods. Furthermore, Hume maintained, if abundance reduced the value of an item, then the more gold and silver a nation acquired, the less valuable it would be, an idea that undercut the mercantilist emphasis on accumulating precious metals to build wealth. The 18th-century philosopher and economist Adam Smith, also a Scot, criticized mercantilism as well. Smith argued that economic gain for one nation did not mean economic loss for others. Rather, trade could be mutually beneficial for all. One nation could prosper by supplying raw materials to another, which could then convert these materials into finished goods to be sold at profitable prices. Smith also opposed government regulation of the economy. In his view, competition among the producers of goods and the influence of the market, that is, the desires of buyers and sellers made for a healthy economy. If demand for an item were high, its price would rise. If demand were low or quality poor, price would fall. Although Smith believed government should assist business by, say, building roads and providing for national defense, it should not grant monopolies or subsidize businesses. This would only harm consumers by keeping prices artificially high. Without government assistance, business enterprises would have to learn to operate more efficiently, thus reducing prices, or they would fail. Smith also argued that it made little sense for a nation to produce everything it needed. If Spain could make a particular product better than England could or could make it for less money, England should use the revenue generated by selling those goods it excelled at making to buy the Spanish product. England could produce textiles more efficiently than Spain, and Spain could make wine more cheaply than England. It was thus more efficient, Smith explained, for England to buy wine from Spain and Spain to buy cloth from England than for each country to produce both the wine and the cloth they required. Dueling voices. For and against mercantilism, two perspectives. Many Europeans argued that the assumptions underlying mercantilist theory were flawed, and that putting it into practice was often harmful. Following are excerpts from Thomas Munn's 1664 England's Treasure by Foreign Trade and Adam Smith's The Wealth of Nations, published in 1776. Note the very different positions these economists take. The ordinary means, therefore, to increase our wealth and treasure is by foreign trade, wherein we must ever observe this rule, to sell more to strangers yearly than we consume of theirs in value. For suppose that when this kingdom is plentifully served with the cloth, lead, tin, iron, fish, and other native commodities, we do yearly export the overplus to foreign countries to the value of £2,200,000, by which means we are enabled beyond the seas to buy and bring in foreign wares for our use and consumptions, to the value of £200,000. By this order duly kept in our trading, we may rest assured that the kingdom shall be enriched yearly £200,000. Behold then the true form and worth of foreign trade, which is the great revenue of the king, the honor of the kingdom, the noble profession of the merchant, the school of our arts, the supply of our wants, the employment of our poor. Thomas Munn, England's Treasure by Foreign Trade. A great empire has been established for the sole purpose of raising up a nation of customers, who should be obliged to buy from the shops of our different producers all the goods with which these could supply them. For the sake of that little enhancement of price which this monopoly might afford our producers, the home consumers have been burdened with the whole expense of maintaining and defending that empire. For this purpose, and for this purpose only, in the two last wars, more than 200 millions have been spent. It cannot be very difficult to determine who have been the contrivers of this whole mercantile system. Not the consumers, we may believe, whose interest has been entirely neglected, but the producers, whose interest has been so carefully attended to, and among this latter class our merchants and manufacturers have been by far the principal architects. Adam Smith, The Wealth of Nations. What does Munn believe are the benefits of mercantilism? Do you believe this is a realistic assessment? Why or why not? What does Smith regard as one of the worst of mercantilist policies? How might he respond to Munn's claims? Because mercantilist theory saw economic gain for one nation as necessarily a loss for others, European nations engaged in trade wars as each tried to use tariffs to bar others from its markets. At times, real wars accompanied trade wars. England and the Netherlands fought 4 wars over the course of the 17th and 18th centuries, partially to gain control of transatlantic trade, figure 519. England also fought France for access to the markets of India. The oil painting shows boats with white masts filling the choppy waters on a black and white background. Some boats are destroyed, smoking and sinking, while others are still floating. Smoke billows out into the sky, and people and debris are shown floating in the water. Figure 5. 19. a battle for trade. England and the Netherlands fought 4 wars for control of transatlantic trade in the 17th and 18th centuries. This 1657 ink and oil painting by Willem van de Velde the Elder depicts the 1653 Battle of Scheveningen, a Dutch victory. Credit: The Battle of Terheide by Rijksmuseum/Wikipedia, public domain. Mercantilism affected the relationship not only between countries, but also between classes. For instance, it elevated the interests of merchants and manufacturers over those of workers and consumers by arguing that wages should be kept low. More money would thus remain in employers' hands, and people would be discouraged or prevented from buying luxury goods that could instead be exported for profit. Mercantilists also advocated high taxes to enrich governments. The perceived need to extract raw materials from colonies to benefit the home country's interests often led governments to restrict colonies' economic growth and harshly punish people who sought to evade trade restrictions. The desire to exploit the American colonies also led to the abuse of indigenous populations and enslaved Africans in efforts to extract as much wealth as possible. Learning objectives. By the end of this section, you will be able to explain the workings of the triangular trade, compare slavery in Africa and slavery in the Americas, discuss the way market forces influence the development of labor-intensive agriculture in the Americas, describe the human toll of slavery. To extract the greatest possible wealth from their American colonies, the nations of Europe planted them with cash crops Europeans craved but could not produce at home. To maximize profit, they drove workers hard without regard for their health or safety. When indigenous peoples and European servants could not satisfy their demands, they turned to enslaved labor taken from Africa. The latter decision affected the lives of millions of people for centuries to come. Slavery and the triangular trade. One of the largest migrations in history took place between the late 15th and early 19th centuries, as Europeans forcefully transported approximately 12 million Africans across the Atlantic Ocean to the Americas to provide labor for Europe's economic enterprises. Some 2 million people died on the voyages across the Atlantic. The survivors made possible the extraction of wealth from European colonies on which the system of mercantilism was based. The majority of Africans brought across the Atlantic were destined to labor on sugar plantations in the Caribbean and Brazil. Many enslaved Africans were also sent to the Spanish colonies in South America. Relatively few went to the North American mainland, mostly Mexico. European colonists had originally considered using enslaved indigenous peoples to perform the difficult and dangerous labor of harvesting sugar cane and other cash crops, but these efforts failed. Indigenous people died in large numbers from infectious diseases, leaving too few to labor in the fields. On the island of Hispaniola, for example, where both the Spanish and the French established sugar plantations, the native Taino population was at least several 100,000 strong when Columbus arrived in 1492. By 1514, however, only about 32,000 Taino remained. Some had been deliberately killed by the Spanish, and others had died from hard labor and poor living conditions after being enslaved. The vast majority, though, had died of disease. For Europeans, the ideal laborers would be people as unfamiliar with the terrain as they were, because unlike enslaved indigenous people who knew the best places to hide, they could more easily be recaptured if they ran away. In addition, they would be less affected by many of the infectious diseases from which Europeans suffered. Although Europeans did not understand what caused immunity, they knew those who had previously contracted certain diseases like smallpox and survived would not contract that disease again. They also knew, from long contact with Africans, that they did not die from European diseases in the same numbers that indigenous Americans did. In the European view, Africans satisfied both their key requirements. European indentured servants would also have fit the bill, But the hot Caribbean climate and diseases like malaria and yellow fever, brought from Africa with cargoes of enslaved people, led to high death rates among Europeans within the first year and discouraged most others from immigrating there. Indentured servitude did not satisfy the labor needs of tobacco planters in Virginia and Maryland either, where the death rate among Europeans was also high. Although some indentured servants were convicts sentenced to be transported to the colonies, the vast majority left Europe voluntarily, but they were not enough. In addition, a French law passed in 1664 that restricted planters' right to beat their indentured servants made servants a less desirable form of labor in the eyes of French colonists. Thus, Europeans eager to extract a profit looked to Africa as the solution, and to slavery instead of indentured servitude. They believed Africans were physically better suited to hard labor than Europeans were, and Africans could also be enslaved for a lifetime, ensuring a constant supply of field hands. The Portuguese, already using enslaved Africans to grow sugar on islands off the coast of Africa, were the first to bring them in large numbers to the Americas. The initial Portuguese voyage to do so transported 200 Africans to the Spanish colony of Santo Domingo, on the island of Hispaniola, in 1525. Most were forced to grow sugar for Portuguese colonists in Brazil, or were sold to the Spanish for this purpose. Captured Africans were also sold to the Spanish to work in mines in Mexico and Peru, or to be employed as domestic servants. Soon the British, French, Spanish, Dutch, and Danes were also exporting captives from Africa to produce sugar, rice, indigo, tobacco, and by the 18th century, coffee in the Americas. Although the economic system that relied on the labor of enslaved Africans to grow sugar and other crops for European colonists in the Americas was a complex one, for purposes of simplification, it is often characterized as the triangular trade because it linked three regions, the Americas, Europe, and West Africa, in a network of exchange, figure 5. 20. The shipment of enslaved Africans across the Atlantic was one leg of the triangular trade. In the first leg, Europeans exchanged manufactured goods with African traders for enslaved Africans. The enslaved people were then shipped across the Atlantic to European colonies in the Americas. This journey was called the Middle Passage because it was the middle, or second, leg of the three-legged exchange. The money earned from the sale of enslaved Africans in the colonies was used to purchase the products grown by existing enslaved laborers. In the third leg of the triangle, those goods were shipped to Europe or to a European country's other American colonies, where they were transformed into finished products. A map of the world is shown with North America, South America, Europe, Africa, the Pacific Ocean, the Atlantic Ocean, and the Indian Ocean labeled. The map is titled, The Triangular Trade. A yellow arrow points from the western portion of Europe to West Africa. It is labeled, European Manufactured Goods. A red arrow points from West Africa to the southeastern portion of North America. It is labeled, Enslaved Africans. A blue arrow points from the southeastern area of North America back to the western portion of Europe, labeled, Agricultural Products Produced by Enslaved Africans. Figure 520, the triangular trade. As its name suggests, the triangular trade consisted of three legs. Enslaved Africans were sent along the so-called Middle Passage, the red arrow, and sold in Europe's American colonies, while the agricultural products they produced were shipped to Europe. European manufactured goods were exchanged in Africa for more enslaved people. Attribution. Copyright Rice University, OpenStax, under CC by 4. 0 license. For example, English slave traders exchanged rum for captives in African ports. The captives then traveled across the Atlantic in chains to England's Caribbean colonies, where they were sold to the owners of plantations who set them to work growing sugar cane. The plantation owners then shipped molasses, a byproduct of sugar production, to other English settlers in the colony of Massachusetts, who transformed it into rum and shipped that to England. English ship captains in Africa then exchanged rum along with manufactured products like cloth, guns, and ammunition for captives. African slave traders used the guns to capture more people to send along the Middle Passage, and the cycle continued. Enslaved people were the base on which the triangle rested. Without the sugar, tobacco, coffee, indigo, and rice produced through their labor, the trade would have collapsed. The human toll of the transatlantic slave trade was immense. Conditions on the Middle Passage were brutal, and some ships held as many as 500 to 600 people. Some captains, knowing that 10 to 20% would die on the voyage, packed as many people as possible into the hold, hoping enough would survive to earn them a good profit. In the hold, men were separated from women and children and were chained side by side on their backs, sometimes with only a few inches of space above them. Figure 521. In 1713, the Royal Africa Company, a British company, instructed captains that enslaved people should be allotted a space 5 feet long, 11 inches wide, and 20 inches high. The implication was that captains usually packed people into even smaller spaces. Two black and white aerial drawings of a slave ship are shown. Letters are shown indicating parts of the ship. The top drawing is labeled Fig. V. It shows drawings of people extremely close to one another all around the perimeter of the boat, except for the back. The middle of the drawing is white. The bottom drawing is labeled Fig. IV and shows people drawn extremely close to one another in every portion of the boat in neat rows. There is very minimal space left. Two white spaces in the back left corners of the boat are white and labeled Storeroom. Figure 521 Plan of a slave ship. This 18th century diagram of a slave ship reveals how tightly packed the hold was with human beings. Captains stowed people in every possible space. Credit. Modification of work, Slave Ship Diagram, by Lilly Library of Rare Books and Manuscripts, Indiana University /Wikimedia Commons, public domain. During the voyage, sailors gave the enslaved people food and water usually once a day. There were no facilities for bathing, and men and women alike relieved themselves in buckets or tubs that often overturned in rough seas. Ventilation was poor, the stench was horrible, and the heat excruciating. At times crews would bring the enslaved Africans onto the deck for fresh air, and make them jump and dance to exercise their muscles, since buyers would not pay high prices for those who looked weak. Removing captives from the hold was always a risk for the crew, however, since this was the time when a revolt was most likely to take place. Slave ship captains harshly punished any attempt at rebellion. Taking enslaved people to the deck was also risky, because many used the opportunity to commit suicide rather than endure the misery on board ship or the uncertain fate that awaited them. Some captains strung nets below the ship's rails to catch those who jumped overboard. Illness was the slave ship captain's constant fear. In the close quarters of the ship, infectious disease could sweep like wildfire, and every person who died reduced the captain's profit. The most feared of all diseases was trachoma, an infection of the eyes that did not kill but left its victims blind. Enslaved people who could not see would not be purchased. Even more frightening was the possibility that the infection would spread to the crew. If the sailors lost their sight, everyone on board faced a slow death from starvation as the ship sat adrift in the water, unable to reach any port. Slave voyages were often heavily insured against loss. The captain of the Zong took full advantage of this. When bad weather slowed his ship's voyage across the Atlantic in 1781, members of the crew and the enslaved cargo began to die of illness. Realizing that the ship owner's insurance policy would pay for captives lost at sea, but not for those who died of sickness, the captain ordered 132 enslaved people thrown overboard to drown. African and North American slavery. The captives purchased by European ship captains were sold by other Africans. Europeans did not introduce slavery to Africa. It had existed there for centuries before the triangular trade began. It was different in important ways, however, from the slavery that awaited Africans on the other side of the Atlantic. Slavery existed in numerous African societies, and there were many ways in which a person could become enslaved. In some societies, slavery served as punishment for a crime. In others, people could be enslaved or sell their children into slavery to pay a debt. In times of hardship like famine, parents might sell children to more prosperous people to earn money to support themselves and ensure their children would be fed. In many societies, enslaved people were taken as prisoners of war. Africans enslaved people primarily to enlarge their households, the basic economic units of society. Families suffered if they did not have enough able-bodied people to work in the fields or tend to herds, and slavery provided a solution. Some enslaved Africans remained with the slaveholder their entire lives, but others expected to regain their freedom. Those enslaved to pay a debt, for example, gained their freedom once the debt had been settled. Even people enslaved for life could participate fully in the life of the household or community. They could marry. Their spouse might be free, and their children would be. They might own property, including enslaved people of their own. They were often well respected in the community, especially if they possessed important knowledge or skills. Africans regarded slavery as an unfortunate fate that might befall anyone. Being enslaved did not imply an inherent difference or inferiority. The life of an enslaved person was not comfortable or easy, but it was not often what we think of when we consider Atlantic plantation slavery. Slavery in the Americas was different. It was chattel slavery, in which one person is owned by another as a piece of property like an inanimate object. The enslaved had no status or legal rights as persons. They could be bought, sold, inherited, or given to another. They had no right to control their own bodies or their own labor, and they could be compelled to do whatever the slaveholder wished. Their status could be passed on to their children. In all the European colonies in the Americas, the child of an enslaved woman was born enslaved. Although chattel slavery also existed in Africa, this was the only form of slavery that existed in the Americas. For centuries, Africans had participated in the trans-Saharan slave trade, selling prisoners in North Africa and on the Swahili coast to be transported to destinations in the Mediterranean or the Middle East. The arrival of Europeans willing to pay large sums changed the focus of the African slave trade, however. Africans now captured and enslaved large numbers of other Africans, with the intent of selling them to Europeans for transportation across the Atlantic. Wars were launched against rival peoples solely for the purpose of taking captives, and slave traders led expeditions into the interior of the continent to kidnap people who lived far away. Africans were not safe in their own homes. In the 18th century, slave traders kidnapped young Aloda Equiano, later an abolitionist, and his sister as they played at home. While their parents were gone, strangers climbed over a wall into the courtyard of their house and carried the children away. Some people were tricked and sold to European slave traders by their own relatives. Once captured, people were marched for days to one of the places on the coast where Europeans exchanged goods for human beings. Many died on the way. Slave traders commonly chained their captives together on the journey, and devices were sometimes fixed to captives' necks so that if they managed to escape, they would die of thirst because they could not lower their heads into streams to drink. Once they reached the coast, the traders stripped them naked and shaved their heads to keep them free of lice. The traders then greased their bodies with palm oil to make them look fit and healthy when buyers came. A number of slave trading ports flourished on the western coast of Africa from the 15th through the 18th centuries. Among them were Ouidah, Ouidah, Grand Popo, Jacquem and Porto Novo in modern Benin, Badagry in Nigeria, and Little Popo in Togo. In these ports, English, Dutch, French, Portuguese, Spanish, Danish, and Swedish traders and sea captains bargained with African slave traders for their captives. Some African city-states and kingdoms became wealthy from the slave trade, and their rulers protested only if their own people were taken. King Afonso of Congo told the King of Portugal that, out of a desire for European goods, the people of his own kingdom were capturing their fellow Congolese and selling them to Portuguese traders. He did not denounce the slave trade, but asked only that the Portuguese bring their captives to officials of Congo to be sure they were not free Congolese wrongfully seized. According to King Jizo of Benin, the slave trade is the ruling principle of my people. It is the source and the glory of their wealth. The mother lulls the child to sleep with notes of triumph over an enemy reduced to slavery. The transatlantic slave trade harmed those who remained in Africa as well as those who were taken. Families endured the emotional trauma of losing loved ones. Fear of falling prey to slave traders pervaded villages throughout West and Central Africa. Aloda Equiano recalled that when adults in his village left for the fields, children stationed someone in a tree to keep watch for kidnappers while the others played. The African economy suffered as well. Those most likely to be captured, men and women in the prime of life, had been contributing the greatest share of labor to their communities. When slave traders captured young adults, no one remained to care for children and the elderly, and fewer people were left to reproduce. According to one model, between 1750 and 1850, no population growth occurred south of the Sahara Desert and north of the Limpopo River as a result of the loss of people to the slave trade. To compensate for the disappearance of so many young men, who were the laborers most preferred by plantation owners, many African ethnic groups adopted polygyny, allowing men to take multiple wives. The loss of men also necessitated that women adopt traditionally male economic roles. Desire for the goods Europeans traded for enslaved people also had devastating consequences for Africa. The importation of European textiles, according to some historians, spurred the industrialization of the European textile industry while harming African cloth producers, who could not compete on quantity or price. Weavers continued to produce goods for local markets, but no continent-wide market for African textiles ever had an opportunity to develop because Europeans already dominated the field. There were similar consequences for the African metal industry. These effects have been long-lasting. One scholar has demonstrated that the areas from which the most enslaved people were taken are today the poorest in Africa, though at the time of the slave trade they were among the most developed. They are also more prone to civil conflict today than other areas of the continent. Other studies have shown that people from ethnic groups most likely to have been subject to the slave trade are less likely to trust others than are people from less affected groups. This may be due at least in part to the slave trade's breaking down of the social and political structures intended to protect people. The economics of slavery. Those who reached their final destination faced an existence as hellish as they had experienced on the Middle Passage. The labor to which they were put was backbreaking and never-ending. Most of the crops grown by enslaved Africans in the Americas were labor-intensive. At that time, tobacco seeds had to be planted by hand and the seedlings transplanted in the fields. At harvest time, workers stripped tobacco leaves from the plant, hung them to dry, and packed them in large barrels that they then rolled to the coast or a riverbank to be taken on board ship and transported to Europe. Figure 5.22. A drawing of a plantation is shown. A large white house with an orange roof is in the back middle with trees shown in the background. Large wooden structures with roofs and back walls are drawn on both sides of the image. People are in the open structures sawing wood, grinding items, and working on other various tasks. The men are dressed in pants that go to their knees and no shirts. The women wear short cloths and head dressings. A fire is shown in the foreground with a pot and small structure above it, with a person tending the fire. Two people are squatting in the middle placing items on round structures. Figure 5. 22 harvesting tobacco. This 1670 illustration from Virginia shows enslaved Africans at work on a tobacco plantation. In the open shed on the left, tobacco leaves are being hung to dry. Credit: Tobacco Cultivation, Virginia, ca. 1670. By unknown/Wikimedia Commons, public domain. Rice cultivation also required the transplanting of seedlings by hand. Enslaved people first cleared the undergrowth from swampland, built earthen dikes, and then flooded the cleared land with water. As they worked in the swampy waters, they were exposed to snakes and mosquitoes carrying malaria and yellow fever. Sugar, the most valuable crop grown by enslaved people, also required the most labor, and sugar plantations often contained hundreds of workers. With the exception of the very youngest and the very oldest, all of them toiled all day as part of large work gangs. The labor was grueling and dangerous. Sugar cane was densely planted, and undergrowth in the fields could hide snakes that bit workers. After fertilizing and weeding the cane, workers harvested it by cutting it close to the ground with machetes, and then chopping it into smaller pieces to make it easier to remove from the fields. Machetes wielded in tired workers' sweaty hands often slashed legs and feet. Workers might bleed to death or die when wounds became infected. People who worked too slowly were beaten. Laborers then transported the cut cane to a mill to be crushed by heavy rollers that often caught and mangled workers' hands. This had to be done very quickly, within 24 hours of cutting the cane, because the sap evaporated quickly. The workers boiled the crushed cane to extract a liquid that was clarified and crystallized into sugar, a process that required hours of standing next to roaring fires, where workers were often scalded. To maximize profits, planters rotated production, so while sugar cane was growing in one field, it was being harvested in another. Because sugar cane rapidly depleted nutrients in the soil, laborers frequently also had to clear land for new fields. In addition to growing and processing sugar cane, enslaved people had to tend to the plantation's buildings and livestock, and cut the wood needed to cook the cane sap. Slaveholders spent little money on food for the enslaved people, so laborers spent additional time tending their own gardens, fishing, and foraging for wild foods. To give them energy and dull their pain, slaveholders often gave them shots of rum, a plentiful beverage on a sugar plantation. Link to learning. Visit the National Museum's Liverpool site to learn more about slavery in the Caribbean and how archaeologists have learned about this institution. Beyond the book, contrasting images of slavery. Few European painters created images of slavery. François-Auguste Beard of France and Agostino Brunias, who was born in Rome and lived on the Caribbean island of Dominica, were exceptions. The first painting that follows, by Brunias, shows women at the market, figure 523. The women in the center wearing white may be free women of color, a favorite subject of this artist. This painting shows two women in long white elaborate dresses and ornate hats. They walk through a group of dark-skinned women in simpler dresses and head dressings. The lighting of the painting is centered on the two women in the center, and most of the other people in the painting look at them. One of the women points at some linens on a table while talking with the other woman. A group of women in plain white and solid-colored dresses, and a man in a large hat without a shirt, are sitting and squatting in the bottom right corner over green leaves on the ground. A woman behind them nurses a child. The left corner of the painting shows men in waistcloths and no shirts sitting on the ground listening to a standing man who is almost naked except for a small loincloth, hat, and ornate scarf. Behind him, there is a lady sitting behind a table dressed in a white dress, gloves and hat, holding a parasol over her head. In the background, there are people walking, talking, and dancing. Buildings, water, mountains, and trees can be seen in the background. Figure 5. 23. A market in the West Indies. This painting by Agostino Brunias, A linen market with a linen stall and vegetable cellar in the West Indies was made about 1780 and depicts women at an outdoor market. Credit, A Linen Market with a Linen Stall and Vegetable Cellar in the West Indies, by Yale Center for British Art / Wikimedia Commons, public domain. The second image by Beard was made approximately 50 years later, shortly before slavery was abolished, for the second time in the French colonies, figure 5.24. At the center of this painting, two men in loose shirts and pants kneel next to a black man who lies on his back with no shirt and covered with a blanket from the waist down. Four men in African cultural head dressings and armbands stand behind, holding spears and looking concerned at the man lying down. In the left center, a man brands a female who is wearing a cloth over her lower body. Above them on the left, people are whipped and loaded onto ships. A white man in pants and a hat stands in the forefront. In the lower right, a man in long, colorful robes and a pointy hat with a feather at the top sits smoking a long pipe. Behind him, a white man in a suit, tie and hat reclines on a chair with a book in front of him. Behind him, a naked woman with a red scarf on her head watches the scene in the middle. Behind her, a black man with a necklace around his neck looks away. Other men and women are in the background, as well as water, ships, and mountains. Figure 524, The Slave Trade. This 1840 painting, The Slave Trade by François-Auguste Beard, is set in a slave market on the coast of West Africa. Credit, The Slave Trade, Slaves on the West Coast of Africa, by National Underground Railroad Freedom Center, Gift, 1933 / Wikimedia Commons, public domain. How do these paintings differ in subject matter and style? Brunia's has been described as depicting slavery in a romantic way. Where do you see evidence of this in the paintings shown here? What details in Beard's painting might make viewers support abolition? Infectious disease, overwork, poor diet, and injuries claimed large numbers of lives. Because infant mortality among enslaved people in the Caribbean was rampant, the enslaved population was not self-reproducing, and slaveholders had to buy more people each year to maintain their labor force. Prices were high. A healthy young adult might cost as much as an average European could earn in a year's worth of labor. In 1684, planters in Santo Domingo, the Dominican Republic, paid 6,000 pounds of sugar per enslaved African. Some 2,500 to 3,000 new captives were required each year. This differed substantially from the English North American mainland colonies, where, because the work of growing and processing tobacco was less physically grueling, enslaved people did not die in such high numbers, and the population was able to grow through reproduction. Despite the conditions in which they lived, enslaved people in the Americas managed to retain their dignity and humanity. Couples married and produced children, some of whom survived. They formed new kin networks, calling fellow laborers brother and aunt, to replace the relatives from whom they had been taken. They created new religions with elements of various African practices and Christian elements learned from their enslavers. They combined foods brought from Africa with local ingredients to create new cuisines that reminded them of home. The influence of Africa persisted in the music, dance, and stories they created. Enslaved people also resisted the slaveholders' efforts to exploit them in numerous ways. They damaged tools, sabotaged machinery, and set fire to cane fields and barns full of sugar awaiting export to Europe. They ran away. In the mountains of Jamaica, runaways formed communities and lived in hiding. On several occasions, enslaved people rose up in armed rebellion, killing the slaveholders and overseers. Largely unmoved by the misery of enslaved Africans, Europeans possessed an insatiable appetite for sugar that only grew as time passed. In 1650, planters in Barbados alone shipped about 5,000 tons of sugar to England. 50 years later, that amount had doubled. As the demand for sugar grew, so did the demand for enslaved laborers. Between 1450 and 1600, Approximately 2,500 enslaved Africans a year were purchased by Europeans. In the 16th century, most of these people were sent to Hispaniola, Cuba, Brazil, and Venezuela. Beginning in the 17th century, however, as England, France, the Netherlands, and Denmark established sugar plantations in the Caribbean, the number of enslaved Africans brought to the Americas rose to some 18,680 per year. Figure 5. 25. In the 18th century, by which time thousands of sugar mills dotted the coast of Brazil and the Caribbean islands, 61,330 people traversed the Middle Passage each year. 42% were sent to labor in the Caribbean and 38% to Brazil. The British colonies of the North American mainland claimed only 4 to 5% of the total. A bar chart titled Enslaved Africans Taken on Board Slave Ships in West Africa shows the following data. Years 1501 to 1525, 702. Years 1526 to 1550, 22,768. Years 1551 to 1575, 46,130. Years 1576 to 1600, 206,528. Years 1601 to 1625, 223,934. Years 1626 to 1650, 160,274. Years 1651 to 1675, 169,362. Years 1676 to 1700, 446,634. Figure 525. Sugar and the growth of the Atlantic slave trade. As the European demand for sugar increased, so too did the demand for enslaved laborers in Brazil and the Caribbean, which together would account for approximately 80% of enslaved Africans brought to the Americas at the turn of the 18th century. Data source: Slave Voyages, Attribution. Copyright Rice University, OpenStax under CC by 40 license. The trade in both sugar and enslaved people sustained numerous industries and employed thousands of people, creating great wealth for some. Shipbuilders, ship captains, and sailors found employment, as did dock workers, freight drivers, customs agents, and workers in sugar refineries. Bakers, pastry cooks, candy makers, and grocers all indirectly made money from sugar. People who made the barrels that held sugar and the other products produced by enslaved people, tobacco, rice, and indigo, profited, as did those who supplied inexpensive clothing, shoes, and foodstuffs like salted fish for enslaved people. Banks and insurance companies earned enormous sums as well, and those who owned large sugar plantations often invested their profits in other industries, built magnificent mansions, or bought luxury goods. Such wealth was easily transformed into political power. Sugar planters in Britain successfully lobbied Parliament to protect their interests, and many planters went into politics, holding seats in the House of Commons, and by using their wealth to purchase titles and estates, the House of Lords. It was thanks to the sugar lobby in Parliament that the British Navy began to give its sailors a daily ration of grog, a mixture of rum, sugar, and lime juice, increasing the profits of British sugar planters even more.